This committee will come to order. Today, we continue our FY24 budget hearings with the Department of the Air Force. I want to thank our witnesses for being here in their service to our nation. The budget request for the Department of the Air Force is a mixed bag. First, the good news. The Space Force benefits from a much-needed 15% increase. I'm pleased with the increased investments toward our distributed architecture in space. We need to transition from large, exquisite satellites in orbit to many smaller satellites in a variety of orbits. This is especially important for missile warning. Diversification will provide us the resilience needed to mitigate the threats we face from China and other adversaries. I also want to highlight General Saltzman's request to make it easier to move Guardians between active and reserve status. This is exactly the type of innovative approach to warfighting we envisioned when we created the Space Force. I'm interested in hearing from General Saltzman on the development of the doctrine and training required to ensure Space Force is postured to fight and win in space. It's a fundamentally different way of thinking than we've become accustomed to these last decades, but it's critically important. With respect to the Air Force budget, the President is requesting a meager 2.9% increase. Given today's record inflation, the President's budget effectively cuts the Air Force by 3%. That will make it harder for the Air Force to manage risk in the near term, especially as it focuses investments on long-term modernization. We should be divesting of capabilities that aren't survivable in a fight against China, and we should be using those savings to invest in advanced technologies capable of prevailing in that conflict. And while I support that approach, we should also ask tough questions about how much risk we're absorbing and for how long. Because the fact is, many of these advanced technologies are a decade away. Based on the testimony we've heard from military leaders over the last year, the CCP is unlikely to wait 10 years before they force a conflict on us. We need to accelerate planned upgrades to our existing fighters, especially the F-35s. We also need to more quickly field promising new technologies such as unmanned collaborative drones and pair them with our existing fleet to enhance capabilities. Fielding new capability in the short term is the key to maintaining a credible deterrence. Unfortunately, the Air Force is missing an opportunity to do that with its tanker acquisition strategy. Frankly, it's foolish to double down on a platform that has consistently failed to meet basic requirements and won't meet them for another 5 years if we're lucky. Relying on a tanker that has trouble refueling when it's too cloudy or too sunny is a tremendous risk. This committee will be conducting vigorous oversight of the tanker program and the Air Force's acquisition strategy. This committee will also be closely monitoring progress on the modernization of our nuclear triad. I'm pleased the budget continues to fully fund Sentinel and the B-21 programs. These programs have received strong bipartisan support from Democrats and Republicans and the White House and Congress because we all understand how critical they are to our national security. I look forward to working with my colleagues to support triad modernization and accelerate infrastructure needed to support it. I also look forward to hearing from General Brown on how we can best expedite the fielding of enhanced capability to mitigate near-term risk. Finally, Secretary Kendall, we are beyond the point of frustration with the continued delay in announcing the final decision on Spacecom basing. 27 months ago, the Air Force made the right decision to go with Huntsville, Alabama. 12 months ago, the GAO and the DOD Inspector General affirmed that decision. There is only one state still protesting, and that state came in 5th in that competition. The political games must end. Your continued hand-wringing is delaying Spacecom's full operational capability and undermining our ability to defend this nation. You need to end this charade and make that announcement soon. With that, I yield to my friend, the ranking member, for any comments he may have.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Chairman. I will not touch that last topic you raised. I am not that state, so plenty to fight about, not my direct fight. I do want to point out, we welcome our witnesses, and we have a fairly steady drumbeat in this committee about disappointment with the size of President Biden's defense budget. Yesterday, the House voted to go back to the FY22 level. All of the Republicans voted for it, no Democrats voted for it. So you're saying the budget isn't big enough, but we should cut it by 20%. Now, I understand that there is this fantasy that somehow defense will be held harmless in this conversation, but it is a fantasy. Defense is roughly 55% of the discretionary budget. If you are going to meet the ridiculous number that was set yesterday by the House, you would have to cut, if you're going to meet it without touching defense, you're going to have to cut everything else by roughly 50%. That's not going to happen. So if you're in favor of going back to the FY22 defense budget numbers, I mean, that's an argument we can have. We can have that discussion. But to be in favor of going back to the FY22 discretionary budget numbers and then to complain that we're not spending enough in the discretionary budget, I mean, it plays politically if you're careful enough about how you do it, but in the real world that we're all going to have to live in pretty soon, like June when the debt ceiling gets hit, and certainly October 1 when this year's fiscal budget runs out, then we're going to have to start occupying the real world instead of the political one pretty soon, or defense is going to pay a very high price for that. Because that sort of cognitive dissonance, if you will, there's another more blunt way of describing that, by the way, but let's just call it cognitive dissonance for the moment, is going to cripple defense. And I applaud the chairman to every hearing. The other thing he does, rightly so, is to have every witness up here tell us how horrible a CR would be for the Department of Defense. Continuing resolutions, also, by the way, horrible for every aspect of the discretionary budget. All right, it's not just defense that gets killed by the fact that you're forced into a CR where you can't start any new programs and you can't get rid of any old programs and you're frozen at a budget number. It is a horrific way to run any financial entity, okay? So, but let's start to have a more realistic conversation about this, or we're going to drive the whole thing off the cliff in a way that is going to be devastating to defense. And that sort of leads into the other opening comments I have. You gentlemen have an enormously difficult challenge. Modernization is so important right now, certainly in everything the Air Force does in space and the traditional Air Force as well. You have to modernize while maintaining our current capability. You have to make a lot of decisions about which systems to invest in that are going to meet both of those very difficult challenges. So you don't need massive budget cuts and trying to deal with the CR or just guessing whether or not we're going to have a government shutdown or a CR as you're trying to meet those very difficult challenges. I do really appreciate what the Space Force is doing. I appreciate the chairman who he and Congressman Cooper had the vision way back that we needed to create the Space Force and how it is important to support it. Look forward to hearing now that we're, about 5 years into it, 4 years, no, less than that, 4 years into it. How's that going? It's a difficult transition. I think you've done an excellent job, but we want to hear how that's working going forward and what your key modernization priorities are. I think the chairman described them quite well in terms of, moving to more distributive systems, taking advantage of commercial opportunities, all to put us in a better position going forward. And then on the Air Force side, we've got a lot of big decisions that we're in the middle of, certainly on the F-35 engine. I would like to get an update on the tanker, how that's going. Those decisions have somewhat been made. But those modernization decisions are going to be key in figuring out how we can meet our current needs and be ready for the future. So definitely want to hear how we're handling all of those challenges. And then lastly, the recruitment issue, which is a challenge, across all services, some more than others, but would really love your thoughts on what we can do to make sure that we're able to continue to attract and retain the talent that we need. I know this is a particular problem for pilots. We've put some incentives in there, but what more can we do to make sure that we can recruit and retain the airmen and guardians that we need in order to meet our national security needs? And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the ranking member. I'd like to introduce our witnesses. First, we have the Honorable Frank Kendall, Secretary of the Air Force, General C.Q. Brown, Jr. as Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and General Chance Saltzman, Chief of Space Operations. Welcome to all of our witnesses. Secretary Kendall, we'll start with you. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the Department of the Air Force's FY24 budget submission. Approximately 1 year ago, I began my testimony before this committee with a quote from General Douglas MacArthur, reminding us that the history of failure in war can almost always be summed up in 2 words: too late. That warning is even more valid today. Over the past year, under the rubric of 7 Department of the Air Force operational imperatives, the Department of the Air Force has worked to define the capabilities and technologies that we need, along with the programs and resources required to deter and, if necessary, prevail over our pacing challenge. China, China, China. In FY24, we are requesting approximately $5 billion as a direct result of this work, and over $25 billion for operational imperative-related investments. War is not inevitable, but successfully deterring conflict is heavily dependent on our military capabilities. In our FY24 budget request, there are approximately 20 completely new or significantly rescoped program elements, some of which are classified, that we must develop, produce, and field if we desire to maintain the air and space superiority that America and our allies have counted on for decades. In order to proceed with any of these programs, the Department of the Air Force needs timely authorizations and appropriations. The Department is ready to move forward with the next generation of capabilities we need, and there is no time to lose. In addition to those new starts or enhanced efforts, the FY24 budget includes requests for additional resources to increase production and accelerate development of programs essential to the DAS missions as defined in the National Defense Strategy. For the strategic triad, we have fully funded the Sentinel ICBM, the B-21 Raider bomber, the long-range standoff weapon, and our nuclear command and control programs. For the conventional forces, we are increasing production of both the F-35 and F-15EX. Next Generation Air Dominance program is funded to move forward, and as indicated last year, an uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft program of record is fully funded in our FY24 request. We are also continuing the acquisition of sensor programs, like the E-7 Wedgetail and the new Resilient Missile Warning and Tracking Space Program. As we indicated last year, hard choices have been required to move the department into the future. We deeply appreciate the support of Congress and this committee for the divestitures we requested last year. This year, we must continue the divestment of the over 40-year-old A-10 Warthog. This program has served us well, but is absorbing resources needed for higher priorities. We ask for Congress's continued support for this and other identified changes we must make to field the forces we need to be successful against our pacing and other challenges. But of course, it isn't all about the equipment we need to perform our missions. It's also about the men and women who serve in the total force, active, guard, reserve, and those who support them. We appreciate Congress's support for a 4.6% pay raise last year. This year, we are asking for a 5.2% pay increase, the largest one-year increase we have ever requested. In line with Secretary Austin's Taking Care of People initiative, we are continuing to invest in child development centers and housing to meet the highest priority needs of our airmen, guardians, and their families. Like the other services, with the exception of the Space Force, the Air Force faces challenges in recruiting in a generation where the propensity to serve is the lowest that we've seen in decades. We are removing barriers to service to ensure that everyone with a capability and desire can serve to their full potential. Under the National Defense Strategy, we are also strengthening teams, both in the joint force and with our allies and partners. Building these relationships and investing in our ability to work together is the essence of integrated deterrence. The effectiveness and importance of these relationships are on display in Europe today, where NATO is stronger than ever. I recently returned from the Indo-Pacific, where I met with a number of our teammates and where I participated in the groundbreaking event for one of the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement air bases in the Philippines. Our budget request also supports strengthening our partnerships around the world, especially when we confront our pacing challenge and most acute threats. I started by talking about the value of time, and I'll finish by highlighting a legislative proposal that can save us up to 2 years of that valuable time. Our proposal would expand rapid acquisition authority so that military departments can move quickly and respond to emerging threats and take advantage of evolving technology. Within reasonable constraints, this legislative proposal would allow progress on compelling national security needs that would otherwise be delayed until the next submission and approval of the President's budget. I've been pushing this reform for decades, and we look forward to working with the Congress on this proposal. In closing, I believe the Department of the Air Force is well postured to move into the future. Our work to define that future is not complete, but has produced compelling results that are reflected in our FY24 budget submission. We look forward to your questions today. We'd like to offer a more complete briefing on the classified details of our submission at your convenience. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Brown, you're up.
Good afternoon, Chairman Rogers and Ranking Member Smith and the distinguished members of this committee. I'm proud to represent the 689,000 total force airmen serving our nation. I want to thank you for your steadfast support for our airmen and their families. It's an honor to join Secretary Kendall and General Saltzman to testify on the fiscal year 2024 budget submission. This budget builds on the progress made in fiscal year 2023 and marks the next milestone towards the transformation of the Air Force to address the evolving security challenges outlined in the National Defense Strategy. As I emphasized last year, we must continue to accelerate change or risk losing our strategic advantage. The Department of the Air Force's operational imperatives describe key capabilities that must be attained to enable the Air Force's modernization in the face of a rapidly changing threat environment. We remain dedicated to ensuring our investments and resources outlined in this budget submission are aligned with the National Defense Strategy so the Air Force can continue to deter our adversaries, prevail in conflict, and execute our mission to fly, fight, and win air power anytime, anywhere. Not sometime in some places, anytime, anywhere. This budget ensures the Air Force continues to provide the nation the assurance of air superiority, the advantage of global strike, the agility of rapid global mobility, and you combine that with the adaptability of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and the authority in our command and control capabilities, providing the ability to sense, make sense, and act. That's what we must do today, and we must be prepared to do tomorrow. In order to provide these core functions to the nation, we must accelerate development of programs essential to our mission with this budget submission. To provide the assurance of air superiority, we're increasing production of F-35 and F-15EX as highlighted by Secretary Kendall, while the next generation air dominance family of systems continues development. To provide the advantage of global strike, we have fully funded the Sentinel ICBM and the B-21 Raider bomber. To provide agility, rapid mobility, we continue the recapitalization of KC-135 fleet with the KC-46 while moving towards the next generation air refueling system. To provide the adaptability of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, we are transitioning to the E-7A wedge tail, complemented by other persistent, connected, and survivable systems. And to provide the authority in our command and control, we continue to mature our advanced battle management system by investing in digital infrastructure and modernizing our cloud-based communications. Last year's budget started our necessary transformation. We indicated that hard choices would have to be made. Often these choices are between current capacity, readiness, and future capabilities. Our message this year has not changed. The Air Force must modernize to counter strategic competitors while balancing risk by divesting platforms and capabilities that have decreasing relevance against the pacing challenge. Investments in speed, agility, and the lethality of Air Force capabilities underwrites the joint force. Our airmen remain the backbone of our Air Force, and we have committed to ensuring their well-being and their development while providing them the resources and opportunities to reach their full potential whenever and wherever the nation calls. The Air Force is dedicated to reducing barriers and improving the quality of service and quality of life for our airmen and their families. Additionally, the success of air power doesn't happen alone. Success is only possible through collaboration with our many stakeholders and teammates. I want to thank the Congress and this committee for their past and continued support. We look forward to working with you on our FY24 legislative priorities, like expanding rapid acquisition authority, furthering modernization at the Nevada Test and Training Range, preventing encroachment on nuclear launch and control facilities, and supporting pilot production through civilian contractor position conversion. While we remain the strongest Air Force in the world, we must continue the change required to address both today and tomorrow's national security threats. We must have teamwork and collaboration with all of our key stakeholders to accelerate providing our airmen the capabilities they need to deter and project credible combat power. We must have on-time appropriations and avoid a continuing resolution to stay ahead of the pacing, acute, and unforeseen challenges now and into the future. There's not a moment to lose. Thank you for the opportunity to be here with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Chair, now recognizes General Saltzman for 5 minutes. Microphone.
Thank you. Again, Chairman Rogers, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the continued support and for the opportunity to testify on the FY24 budget submission. As the Space Force enters its 4th year, we continue to mature as an independent service and are fully delivering on our assigned missions. Since assuming my responsibilities in November, I have traveled globally to engage with guardians, combatant commanders, military service chiefs from partner nations to better understand where the Space Force should focus our efforts. Across the board, each of these groups emphasize the vital role space plays in strategic competition and integrated deterrence. As this committee well understands, competition and deterrence require investment in and modernization of technology, training, and partnerships. This is what the FY24 budget submission for the Space Force does. This budget submission is directly in line with the National Defense Strategy and the Department of the Air Force operational imperatives, as the FY24 budget will allow us to further efforts to develop a resilient space order of battle and prepare for rapid transition to a wartime posture against any potential adversary to fight and win a high-intensity conflict. In conjunction with ongoing modernization projects, the Space Force has several new starts for FY24 to support those efforts. Investing in these modernization projects will allow us to execute our assigned missions as we move forward to better posture for the emerging complexities of the space domain and the threat systems being fielded by strategic competitors. Space is now undeniably a contested warfighting domain. China and Russia define space as such and are investing in technology meant to undermine U.S. advantage in the domain. China, our pacing challenge, is our most substantial threat into and from space, but Russia also remains an acute threat. Both present serious challenges with space capabilities that can track and target U.S. military forces on land, at sea, and in the air. Both can hold U.S. space assets at risk with cyber and electronic warfare, lasers, ground-to-space missiles, and space-to-space orbital engagement systems. These systems threaten the space architecture the nation relies on for prosperity and security. To meet these challenges, the Space Force will prioritize 3 lines of effort. First, fielding ready, resilient, and combat-credible forces. Second, we will amplify what I'm calling the Guardian spirit. And third, we will partner to win. These are directly in line with Secretary Austin's mission, people, and team priorities. In sum, this budget request is designed to deliver the forces, personnel, and partnerships the Space Force requires to preserve U.S. advantages in space. To build resilient, ready, combat-credible space forces, we are accelerating the pivot towards modern, more defendable satellite constellations and support infrastructure. We are conducting transformational force design analysis based on threats, operational needs, and costs so that we can maximize our budget while investing in effective missile warning, space domain awareness, communication, and navigation systems. Additionally, we are investing to ensure our networks are hardened to defeat cyber threats and that we have the operational test and training infrastructure necessary to prepare Guardians for high-intensity conflict. With our second line of effort, we are amplifying the Guardian spirit by recruiting, developing, and retaining the best talent and empowering Guardians to succeed. Investment in space-centric curriculum for entry-level schools will build Guardians laser-focused on space operations in both competition and conflict. Guardians will be empowered through Mission Command to innovate and execute in these scenarios. Notably, and with congressional support, we plan to integrate the space mission elements of the Air Force Reserve into the Space Force to offer Guardians flexible career paths, including both full-time and part-time duty, to retain talent and bring private sector experience to the force. The third line of effort acknowledges that the Space Force relies on partnerships to accomplish our mission. We are investing in training, education, data sharing, and integrated capabilities with our allies and partners. The Space Force will strengthen our presence in all combatant commands where Guardians are already making solid connections with allies and partners. Because of its critical importance, the Space Force is collaborating with commercial space partners to build resilient capacity and leverage emerging technologies. To enhance this partnership, the Space Force is working to eliminate barriers to such collaboration so that we can build enduring advantages and field these capabilities more rapidly. In conclusion, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the FY24 budget request. The Space Force continues to be the preeminent military space organization in the world. Our adversaries seek to challenge our advantage in space, but with the support of this committee, our Guardians will be able to outwork, out-innovate, and outcompete our potential adversaries to ensure that we maintain that advantage. The FY24 budget submission will make this possible, but only if Congress passes timely appropriations. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'll recognize myself for some questions. And that teed up exactly where I was going. As the ranking member mentioned, I try to give all of y'all a chance to talk about what a continuing resolution means. Each of you testified about the importance of your operations, modernization, and is most important, the people and taking care of service members and their families. I'd like for each of you to tell me what a continuing resolution what impact would it have on your ability to deal with those three priority areas? Secretary Kendall, we'll start with you.
Well, in a word, it's devastating. We've gotten used to having a 1 quarter or so continuing resolution, and we've made some adjustments in our planning to take that into account, contract in particular. But the impact is significant. And as we enter more completely into an era of competition with a strategic competitor like China, it's even more significant. I mentioned the numbers of new starts that we have. We can't start those programs until we have authorization and appropriations. We are effectively giving away a significant block of time to our adversaries to move forward while we are standing still. I used a quote the other day from the movie Casablanca, where people come to Casablanca to sit and wait and wait and wait. We're waiting now. We did the work to define the operational imperative requirements and priorities. We spent most of the last year getting that into the budget and getting it over here to be submitted to the Congress, and now we're waiting for the Congress. All of that is time that we could use to move forward potentially. CR has that impact. It has impact on our people across the board. The pay raise that I talked to you about, we would probably find some way to keep that going, but we'd have to fund it out of other things. So there are a number of impacts, and overall, I'll just repeat, it's devastating to the department.
General Brown.
I'd echo exactly what Secretary Kennedy said. It's devastating. If you have a pacing challenge, it's hard to stay ahead of your pacing challenge when you continue to take breaks because of continuing resolutions. Yeah. We've got to keep the momentum going. It not only impacts what we do for our operational capabilities, it impacts the defense industrial base and how we work with our partners there, but it also impacts our airmen and their families because as we start to look at each summer cycle for moves and pay raises and those kinds of things, a lot of uncertainty for them. Our job as leaders is to provide them some level of certainty in a very uncertain world. Yep. And so that creates a huge challenge for us, and we want to continue to get the funding on time so we can actually not lose buying power. Because we lose for this for the Department of the Air Force, it'd be about $9 billion of lost buying power, in addition to the new starts that Secretary Kendall highlighted.
Yeah, General Saltzman, it's obvious since you would get a 15% increase, what it would mean to you. Can you give us a couple of specifics, new start programs that would be impeded by CR?
Sir, it would be devastating. Let me just start there. If we, had to go back to FY22 levels, because that doubly compounds the increases we've gotten over the last couple of years, or could get over the next couple of years, it cripples the effort of the Space Force. The counter space capabilities that we are putting in place to both pivot to a more resilient architecture to protect our mission set, as well as be able to conduct full spectrum operations that creates deterrence against our pacing challenge, those mostly are still in new start status. And so that I am losing the time and efforts that are going into that to be able to respond to a contested space domain under a CR.
Right. Well, we need to stop calling a CR a continuing resolution and recognize it's a Chinese resolution. That is the only entity that benefits if Congress does not do its work and get spending bills passed in a timely manner. General Brown and General Saltzman, if y'all had the resources, which technologies would you move to the left to help you close the gap between what we and the Chinese would be doing in Taiwan?
Well, Chairman, I would look at several things. Part of it is just the capacity as we start to bring in some of our new aircraft. I'd also add in aspects of munitions because that's an area that we have not historically funded as well. You'll see in this year's budget we have multi-year procurement for 3 weapons for AMRAAM, JASSM-ER, and LRASM. I'd look at being able to do that. I'd also look at the aspects of the things we put into the operational imperatives. One of those that for the Air Force is a collaborative combat aircraft to be able to ensure that continues forward. I would also highlight our nuclear portfolio to ensure it stays fully funded. And then as we work with small companies and other parts of the commercial sector, the ability with the legislative proposal that Secretary Kendall outlined. It's tough to keep them alive and those good ideas alive over 2 years. And so to be able to bring those forward with that legislative proposal provides that opportunity to look at the advanced capabilities that we can bring into the Air Force much faster than we do today.
Okay. My time's expired, Chair, and I recognize the ranking member.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, can you talk a little bit about the programs, how important it is to discontinue some of the programs you're discontinuing? We frequently have those fights here and just want to sort of cue members up. Again, modernization is so important. What are you discontinuing and why is it important that we try not to get in your way?
Continuing, I think, was the word. Ranking.
Yeah, well, programs that you're terminating to order
Terminating.
fund. You know, well, terminating is the wrong word.
Divesting.
Right, divesting from certain programs, shutting down certain settings. So you do that in order to free up the money for a lot of the investments. That the
It's
chairman
certainly
was talking
true.
about.
Well, I'll start with the A-10, which I mentioned in my opening comments.
Yeah.
It's over 40 years old. It was, in its time, a great aircraft that served us well. I was an advocate for that program for a long time, but it doesn't scare China. It still has some limited utility, but we have to get on with things which are going to be more capable relative to the threat. We have some other divestitures that we're taking out the rest of the AWACS, J-STARS, so we can transition to a new generation of sensors which are more survivable. Some of that will, of course, be in space. Some of that will be programs like the E-7. We are taking out, as an efficiency, basically, another tranche of T1 trainers, and we're moving to a more efficient training program that doesn't rely on that intermediate trainer step as part of the process. We are taking out the oldest F-22, something we asked for last year. Those are not fully combat capable. They're only used for training, would not be deployed in wartime against the pacing challenge, and basically represent a savings of about $2 billion that we can turn to things which would be much more effective. So I think those are kind of at the top of the list. There are a few others that are being replaced as a result of recapitalization primarily, F-15Cs and KC-135s, for example. So does that get to your question?
Yeah, that's very good. General Brown, did you want to comment on any part of that and how important it is for the Air Force?
Well, it's not only the Secretary Kendall did an excellent job of laying out all the programs, and there's not anything else I think I would add to that. But what I would add is it's the airmen, the aspect of the airmen that actually operate and maintain the platforms that those that want to hold on are the same airmen that will operate and maintain the things we're trying to buy. And so we have a disconnect, and they've got to be trained in order to operate those new platforms. And so we have to phase that out. And if we continue to hold on to things, then those airmen are tied up and we can't move to the future to those additional capabilities we're trying to invest in. So we've got to do all that together to help us move forward.
Terrific. Thank you, General. General Saltzman, when it comes to space launch, the chairman again mentioned, the modernization efforts there. I know we're coming up on, I think, the Phase 3 awards for the next series of launches. Competition's really important where that is concerned. And the advancements we've made in the last, little over 15 years now, and we used to just have one launch provider. Now there are multiple that are trying to get in. I just want to really emphasize the importance of trying to make sure that there's as much competition as possible. But can you talk a little bit about your Phase 3 plans, how competition and the better use of commercial partnering is going to help get us a better, more cost-effective satellite infrastructure?
Yes, sir. Thank you. I think the idea of 2 lanes for space launch providers is a solid way of both protecting the access to space for our most heavily mission-assured missions, our lowest risk tolerance missions, while opening up an avenue for highly competitive emerging launch providers to also have business and be able to conduct launches and prove themselves as providers. We have to thread the needle a little bit because we have to have assured access for the national security launches, but we want to maximize competition for those emerging providers. I think a 2-lane approach is a nice balance of those competing requirements.
And I think that makes sense. And as we talked about yesterday when we met, one of the keys to that, though, is on those more difficult launches, and it's not a bright line distinction as we discussed. Some move one to the others. If you get into one of those contracts for those first 39 launches, you get support money to make sure you're meeting those more difficult national security ability. And we would like to have as many providers capable of doing that as possible. So I hope you'll consider that as you're finalizing the plans to make sure we maximize the competition in that way. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I want to begin by thanking you for hosting the Intelligence Committee at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for our retreat. Your contribution in making the point of the Department of Defense and certainly the Air Force, not only as a customer of intelligence, but a generator of intelligence, was well received. And I also want to thank you for staying and participating as we had the Director of the CIA, the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of NSA. It was very wonderful for everybody to have you and to be hosted by you. So I appreciate that. My first question is going to be about the F-35 program to you, Mr. Secretary. The adaptive engine transition program that you were not able to avail yourself of is not in this budget. At the McAleese Security Conference in mid-March of this year, you stated, quote, "If we had the opportunity to reconsider the adaptive engine transition program, I think that would be something I'd like to have another shot at." Could you take a moment and just tell us what the AETP technology program would provide you, and is this a funding constraint? Because obviously that's of great concern to us here.
Thank you, Chairman, Congressman Turner. And follow up on your comment, I did enjoy that very much. I thought it was a great conference you put on, so thank you for doing it. AETP is, I think my exact expression in the conference was something to the effect that if there was something I regretted in the budget, it was the fact that we were not able to afford it. I support the decision that we did make, which is to go with the ECU, which is the upgrade to the existing engine. The AETP alternative offers significantly more costs, more range and fuel efficiency. It also would offer more takeoff power to drive all the systems on the aircraft. The only service that had a strong interest in that engine was the Air Force, and as you know, the F-35 supports the Marine Corps, the Navy, and the Air Force in various versions. There's a question as to whether or not you could get the AETP into the Navy's version. It can clearly not go into the Marine Corps version. So when the department looked at this overall and looked at its alternatives, the right decision for the department as a whole was to go with ECU. The cost increment to get AETP into production is several $billion over the FIDIP. And it was just more than we could bear from the point of view of the Air Force trying to finance that on its own. So that's where we ended up.
Right. Those do sound like that they are significant advances, though. I do appreciate you listing those for us. Mr. Secretary, I'm as you noticed, because you were there, I'm from an Air Force town. I'm always concerned about the Air Force's ability to market itself. And marketing sometimes it is used as a commercial word, but the reality is sometimes it's just standing up for yourself and advocating for yourself. I was a little concerned when I got the posture statement from the Air Force and that everything was combined. You've got the Space Force, which the chairman spent a significant amount of time, and advocacy for establishing, is 3 pages in your posture statement. And I went and looked at the Navy's because I thought, that's the best structure that we can have. The Secretary of the Navy's last year was 27 pages. The Marines, who've been around for a while, this isn't like the Space Force, which is brand new, was 24 pages. And then the Chief of the Navy was 14 pages. And we get from all of you guys today 14, with Space Force being just 3. And I just think that there's a whole lot more we probably need to look at with respect to Space Force. And I have a couple questions for you, General Saltzman, and I hope next time you guys take advantage of the opportunity make the case for the Air Force, make the case for for the Space Force, and some of the things that you need for us. This is your opportunity to advocate. General Saltzman, one of the concerns I had, and I think everybody up here has with respect to Space Force, is you're not an agency, you're not a bureau. You're our new service branch. And we wanted you to have the best and the greatest flexibility because we have to move at the speed of our adversaries, especially in space. Do you have the hiring flexibility that you need, and do you have the acquisition flexibility that you need? Because those were 2 of the major tenets that the chairman was waving when we all marched behind and established Space Force. General?
Well, I won't pretend that we're not rapidly learning lessons that we need to learn as a brand new service, but I think we've come a long way in our first 3 years, starting our 4th year now. I think we have the processes, the procedures. I believe Mr. Calvelli, after he's been installed as the Assistant Secretary for Space Acquisition, has done a tremendous job laying out a new set of tenets for how we acquire space capabilities. I think in the last 15 months, we've showed a demonstrated way to put capabilities on orbit faster. And from a hiring standpoint,
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The minority side of this appreciates facts quickly delivered in concise manners. We don't need 27 pages, we need facts. And so we're happy with 3 pages. Perhaps the gentleman reads more quickly than we do. Do not baffle us with your length of words. Secretary Kendall, I know that you're recused from decisions regarding the Sentinel. However, I suspect you're up to date on the scheduling problems for the Sentinel. Could you please tell us where we are with the scheduling for the Sentinel and what you're doing about it?
I am recused because of a consulting relationship I had with the Prime when I was out of government. I am monitoring the program, but I'm not able to make any decisions on it. There was just an adjustment to the program that Acquisition Executive Andrew Hunter worked with Undersecretary LaPlante. The program is realizing some risk areas. What they're doing on the program is trying to address all the possible ways that the program could get in trouble, not just the ones currently on the critical path, and trying to move forward as efficiently as possible across the front. It's a very complicated, very large program, both of which adds a lot of risk to the program. It's also been a very long time since we did an ICBM like this, so we don't have the sort of recent experience we'd like to have. At this point, as far as I know, we are still holding to the schedule for IOC, but my sense of this is that I think it's going to be a challenge to make that. We have to do everything we can to get that system fielded on time.
Thank you, sir. Needless to say, the Sentinel has been of significant controversy in this committee, and the schedule is of utmost importance to us to understand it, given that we have a no-bid contractor, no competition contractor. So we're going to watch it closely. My next question really goes, again, to you and to General Brown. Land acquisition around our key Air Force bases is ever increasing. For example, Travis Air Force Base in California is now surrounded on 3 sides by some LLC. We have no idea who the owner is. Frankly, I think that the Air Force and also the other departments need to pay more attention to what's going on outside the fence. Could you please comment about your intense interest in resolving these issues and making it a priority? If it's not your intense interest, then I shall comment again.
It is a concern. And we've had one instance where we found that the tools available to us would not allow us to prevent a foreign-controlled entity basically from establishing itself fairly close to one of our sensitive facilities. And we were able to work with the local community to affect that so that that didn't happen in that case. But that's a very awkward and, one at a time kind of an approach to a problem that may be much more systemic than we'd like. So it is a concern. I share that concern with you. The tools we have, like CFIUS, for example, which are used to, to monitor and to block, if necessary, business acquisitions, wouldn't apply in this situation. And quite frankly, I think some of our potential adversaries are pretty intelligent about finding options that allow them to get access to places where they want to be able to see what we're doing. And we have to be vigilant about that and develop new tools as necessary to respond to that.
I would expect, sir, you and General Brown to tell your base commanders, all of them, everywhere, to pay attention to what's going on outside the fence. That did not happen at Travis. Perhaps nearly $750 million now been spent acquiring land on all 3 sides, and very deep. I'll let it go at that. Be sure that we're going to be following up on it. Finally, in the pandemic, there were advanced payments made to keep the prime contractors in business. Turns out that the reports from those of that money indicated that the money was not spent to advance R&D or capital outlays, but rather to buy back stock and to advance the well-being of the executive officers. I therefore hope, and this will be a final comment here, that we do not continue to advance 100% advance payments. Attention to that report would be necessary. Sir, you've got about a very, very short period of time, but your comments.
Yeah, we are paying attention to that, and I think that the Undersecretary for Acquisition is about to modify the rules so that we don't advance quite as much as we did during COVID.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Lamborn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. Secretary Kendall, overclassification of space matters is a serious issue that I believe is inhibiting rapid progress in space technology developments. Congress and this committee, led by Chairman Rogers, have made it clear that we want the department to review classification of space programs and reclassify, where possible, to facilitate broader collaboration between industry and foreign partners, along with a more robust public discussion. I chaired a Strategic Forces Subcommittee hearing yesterday in which Assistant Secretary Plum assured me that the department is working on this, but I'm interested in your opinion on this issue and what steps you're taking to ensure that this review will be completed rapidly that we have called for and reported back to Congress.
We are looking at classification in general for several reasons. One is to enhance cooperation, as you said, to make it easier for people to work together. The major effort that we've done recently on that is with special access programs, where the Air Force in particular has a great many compartments, and it's hard to move across them. The work we were doing on the operational imperatives, we had to go do an extensive amount of bureaucratic work to allow people just to talk to each other so they could share information. And that was true not just within the Air Force, but also across services. Now that's for our more highly protected things. At the other end of the spectrum are things where we can work with our partners and work with commercial industry much more effectively if we can declassify. So we are looking at that as well. We do need to protect our sensitive information. Just saw a glaring example, a very visible example of what happens when you don't do that, what kind of things can get out. So this is not a simple problem. It has a lot of different dimensions, and we're trying to attack all of them, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. Also, Secretary Kendall, I want to bring up this issue. I'm deeply concerned about moving Space Command's headquarters. I believe it'll undermine our national security at a time when China and Russia are becoming more aggressive with their space capabilities. I understand that the command is months away from achieving full operational capability at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado Springs. This means that we would be moving backwards in our efforts to organize space as a warfighting domain if we move the command away from Colorado Springs, wherever it might be moved to, because moving would delay full operational capability by 4 to 6 years. I'm encouraged by reporting that suggests that these issues are being seriously considered in the reevaluation of the previous basing decision, and I am happy to continue providing any information or insights that would be helpful. Will you commit that all relevant criteria will be weighed as you make the final decision, and that we can continue having an open dialogue on this issue?
Yes, Congressman, I will. I think you and the chairman might have slightly different points of view on this, but we are taking into account all the issues that have been raised. As you mentioned, final operational capability will be reached in a relatively short period of time, shorter than was originally planned. However, there is a disruption, of course, associated with any move. So we're trying to take into consideration all possible factors that will affect the final decision.
Very good. Thank you so much. And I'm going to revisit an issue that the ranking member brought up, General Saltzman, with the space launch phase 3 approach. General Saltzman, you gave a good answer to the ranking member. Secretary Kendall, I'd like to see your response with the phase 3 approach. And do you agree with General Saltzman? And what would be the advantages or disadvantages of having the 2 lanes in the phase 3 approach?
Yeah, I approve the acquisition strategy that Frank Calvelli came up with. I thought it was really balanced a lot of competing things very well. It allows us to bring new entrants in fairly fluidly, but it also gives us the assured access for the higher risk missions that General Saltzman mentioned. You know, I talked to Mr. Calvelli this morning about this. In fact, we had a draft RFP on the street. We've gotten about 2,000 comments on that draft RFP. He's going to go through all those. He's open to other ideas. That's why we put out a draft. At the end of the day, what happens in Lane 2 in particular, where the more high emission assurance missions, depends a lot on the business case for that. And there's some costs associated with having an additional competitor there. and you lose some of the economies of scale if you do that. But he will take a look at that and see if it makes sense.
All right, thank you. And General Saltzman, anything else to add to what was just said? Okay, thank you. Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman, and the witnesses for being here today. And for Spaceman, if you two can't figure out Jersey, we'll take it with no problems. We'll handle that for you. Yes. Secretary Kendall, thanks for the meetings that we have had, and particularly when we're talking about whatever you want to call it, a retirement, a divestiture. Some people might even call it a target. But we understand that at some point we must put an end to some of the legacy systems that are no longer useful. The wisdom comes in what is useful and what isn't. But for the F-22 Block 20 that we've spoken about, I think it was $470 million for 24 that you would look at for savings. What was slightly different about the retirement that was proposed is that you suggested these funds would go directly to NGAD, that next generation air fight that we are looking at. Can you talk to us why we're going to take an F-22 that some suggest is not up to the fight anymore and put it directly to NGAD? Are they a one-to-one switch?
You can make that comparison, Congressman, but money's fungible. You can look at different things that one could buy with the savings from retiring those F-22s. I think they're the equivalent of about 17 F-35s, right? If you look at the $2 billion over the fit-up. So that's currency. You can talk about it and to kind of help you with the decision. NGAD is the priority right now. Getting the replacement for F-22 through development and into fielding is a priority for us. But it's not necessarily a this or that. It's not that straightforward. We would have to go look at our lowest priority thing to cut in order to put additional funds into the F-22, and that would not be NGAD.
Thank you. Let me shift things over a little bit to what is being suggested you call NGAS. Just to confuse people a little bit more, it's that next generation of air refueler. We right now have the KC-46, which is coming online and is servicing the bulk of our force. But we're talking about looking at a stealth technology that would be in contested areas. You're going to ask for the analysis of alternatives this year, but can you talk to us about the technical feasibility and affordability of this new platform and how that would fit in?
Yeah, the program I'm referring to is NGAS, which is the Next Generation Aerial Refueling System. As I've been in office, the threat continues to get more stressing. And one of the things we recognized this year was that the range of anti-air capability being fielded by the threat is reaching further out. And it's getting out to the ranges at which it threatens aircraft like our tankers. And to have tactical fighters that can operate effectively, you've got to retank them within a few hundred miles of where they're going to operate. So we need tankers that can get into ranges where they are now threatened. Current tankers are not very effective at that. And a commercial derivative tanker, which is a traditional route to getting one, is probably not going to be effective either, although that's not off the table yet. So the analysis you mentioned would start us down the path of working with industry to define options and sort out what our requirements were. Something that is more stealthy is certainly one approach that would have some interest. It also, if you're going to go to a new design, there's some new technologies that are much more efficient from a fuel efficiency point of view that we could possibly consider that currently don't exist in the commercial world. So it's a wide open study that we're talking about at this point, but it's all driven by the threat. And as far as affordability is concerned, we don't have an option. If we're going to be able to operate effectively, we're going to have to do this. And maybe General Brown might want to comment on that, but I don't think we have any choice, Congressman, about that.
Thank you. General Brown?
I would just add, in this initial analysis, I don't think we should constrain ourselves from an affordability standpoint. I think we need to look broadly at what the options are and then be able to back into what options we're going to be able to afford to put onto whatever platform ends up being the next generation air refueling system. And so I wouldn't necessarily want to constrain ourselves in the initial analysis to determine what capabilities are available.
Thank you, and I yield back, Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Brown, the Air Force originally planned to purchase 144 F-15EXs. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And now we're looking at 104?
That is correct.
All right, that's a 30% reduction. That's a pretty significant reduction. These aren't aircraft that we're just standing down. These are new aircraft that we're not going to purchase, correct?
That's correct.
So I know we've talked about the A-10s a lot. Right now we have 57 fighter squadrons. 7 of those are A-10s. If we take all of those down, now we're at 50. Air Combat Command says that we need 60 fighter squadrons. Are we going to be, I mean, it seems to me as we stand down the older equipment, the legacy fleets, that we're not purchasing the replacements for them fast enough to create the additional squadrons that we need.
Well, here's one part I would offer is one area that helps us out is to have a budget on time so we can get the capability. The other thing I'd also share with you, the analysis done by and what the commander of Air Combat Command has talked about is if we continue to operate exactly the way we do today, then that drives the one requirement. But I also think about how we have to operate in the future, which means we're going to have to do some things differently. And I also think about not just the platforms, but it's also the mix of other capabilities that come with those platforms. So it's not just the fighters, it's the munitions, it's the sensors that go with it to increase the capability of the platforms that we are purchasing going forward. If you think about how we've operated in the past, we've had a number of, back in World War II, it would take a number of bombers to hit one target. We are much more capable today, and that's the aspect of how we have to think about as we balance that risk and as we work the demand signals from the combatant commands.
I understand that, but I just want you to know there's concern about taking down squadrons faster than standing them up. And our readiness rate on our 5th-gen equipment is certainly not where any of us want it to be. And so my concern when I look at all of it is not taking down legacy fleets. It's not recapitalizing the fleet as a whole and making sure that we have the equipment that we need to do the things we're having to do right now, plus take on China, especially if the readiness rate of our 5th-gen equipment doesn't improve. And so I'm more concerned about not purchasing the additional F-15EXs and not creating additional squadrons than I am standing down some of the legacy equipment that we know will not last in the fight against China. One final question that I have is we talk about the airmen, the pilots, pilot shortages. What plans do we have for retention of pilots pushing forward? If we're standing down these units, these pilots want to fly, and they're not going to hang around if they don't know there's going to be an aircraft for them to fly. How are we handling and mitigating the loss of our pilots?
One of the things, Rep. Scott, is one of the things, our goal is to stay ahead of the aspect of when our airmen decide and hit that fork in the road when their active duty service commitment is over. And so one aspect we've been able to do with the legislation and the NDA for 23 was to approach these pilots not in the year that they're getting ready to separate, several years prior to when they're going to separate, when they're having that conversation with their family. The other part of this is the flexibility in that bonus, but also in the flexibility in assignment of preference. And then the last thing I'd also highlight is it's not just what we do for the pilots and allow them to fly, which is important, but it's also how we take care of their families. Because that is a real key aspect of why many of us, decide to separate because of the family dynamics of spouses with a career, education of our children, and stability. And so those are the things we got to take care of all those together to ensure we retain that capability, particularly as we look at how the airlines are hiring as well.
You've got to take care of all of them, but ultimately, General, and you know this as well as anybody, a pilot wants to fly. And so if the commercial aircraft carriers are taking care of their families as well, and they have a seat in the cockpit of a Boeing that's a commercial airliner, we're going to lose those pilots. I appreciate you.
Chair, I now recognize the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gallego, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General Brown, as you know, Arizona is home to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, which serves a crucial role in keeping Americans across the country safe. With almost 10,000 service members currently stationed there, it has hosted complex missions, maintains convenient access to training ranges and airspace, and enjoys robust support from the local community. My understanding is that the base is transitioning to an Air Force Special Operations Command power projection mission. Can you describe what this mission will entail from an Air Force perspective, and what mile markers the community should be aware of leading to it? Also, how can the Air Force best support Davis-Monthan as it makes this transition?
Well, first of all, great support from your delegation, but also from the community from Davis-Monthan, and we've had a chance to engage with the leadership there in the community. As we make the transition from A-10 to this power projection wing that's special operations, it's a combination of bringing in our AMC-130s, AC-130s, light attack aircraft, in addition to the EC-37 that will come into to Davis-Monthan, as well as aspects of rescue will also come into Davis-Monthan. So it's a combination of capabilities. And then the other key part of this is their access to the ranges that are there in Arizona and in the western United States will increase their training opportunity. As we work very closely with the community and with the delegation, it's the flow of airmen and the transition. And as we do that, and as we've talked, and we continue the SATAFs, the visits to the base to get more detail. We'll also look at the MILCON, but also the personnel numbers, because overall it should be neutral, or it may be just a bit of a bump up in personnel when it's all said and done.
As a follow-up, then, modernizing the force to face the new threat is a key theme in your written statement in this year's President's budget. The department is also calling for the additional divestment of 42 A-10s, a platform that provides crucial close air support to our troops, something that I've experienced myself. I understand that the intent is for current and future platforms to execute this mission through the advancement of technology. My concern, however, is an over-reliance on technology to the point of forces potentially losing basic skills, such as non-guided by electronics, and the Air Force foregoing a generation's worth of experience. Can you describe how the Air Force is ensuring its pilots remain proficient in CAS as a whole, and what steps is the Air Force taking to ensure that technology-forward CAS can still be effective in a comms-degraded environment or a denied environment that which we anticipate should the balloon go up with China?
You know, one thing, Rep. Gallo, that I would highlight is not only for the United States Air Force, but really for the joint team, as you look at our joint doctrine, it outlines how we do close air support. Much of the technology that we're using to be able to do close air support is really based on that very basic doctrine before we had the technology. And so how do we take that technology and make it a little bit easier to be able to execute? What we want to be able to make sure is that our air crew, as well as all those that are working close air support, can still operate in degraded environments. So you need to understand the basics of how to be able to do this, but then the technology just makes the job easier. The other part I would highlight with this is as we bring that technology in, it allows us the capability to bring it across a number of different platforms. And I'll just tell you from personal experience, having flown close air support in the F-16, floating B-1 and B-52 in combat, that technology and being able to work and be able to bring combat air power to where it's needed to support the operation on the ground or any place else is what we're going to do as a United States Air Force.
Secretary Kendall, you mentioned multiple times in your testimony that Chinese Communist Party is our pacing threat. I'm deeply concerned by growing aggression and provocations from CCP, and I believe that Chinese leadership is closely watching what's happening in Ukraine. Within that context, what lessons has your department learned from Russia's invasion, specifically regarding space technology and the rapid employment of commercial technology from the European theater? And what should or should we not implement in the Indo-PACOM as a result?
I guess, Congressman, the first things on my list would be the importance of space and the presence of space on the battlefield effectively, and the absence of air power, or at least air power dominance by either side. We are seeing space being used for communications. We're seeing space being used for imagery, for targeting. We're seeing counter space systems attempted, at least soft kill systems. So space is part of the fight, and it's an important part of the fight. So that's first. On the air side, neither side's been able to achieve air dominance, and that's had a fundamental impact on what's happened on the ground. Both sides have been able to use their ground-based air defenses reasonably effectively to counter the other side, particularly, though, Ukraine, against a much superior force, theoretically with technology, but certainly with numbers. You know, we're watching all this carefully and learning from it. the importance of having a well-trained Air Force and an Air Force that can work together well as a team and employ technologies effectively is
Gentleman's time's
fundamental as well.
expired. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Saltzman, I understand the department is costing out two options for the Air National Guard Space Forces. Establish a Space National Guard or rebuild the mission into the Space Force. Can you briefly explain the critical must-have capabilities that exist in the Air National Guard? If the decision is made to dissolve those National Guard space capability, would there be any degradation or loss to your ability to support our national defense?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, the capabilities in the Air National Guard are vital. For example, the nation's only survivable strategic missile warning capability lives in the National Guard. About 60% of our deployable space electronic warfare is in the Air National Guard. And of course, we run a missile warning radar through the Air National Guard in Alaska. Vital capabilities that we can't do without.
Thank you. And Secretary Kendall, the Air Force is currently retiring KC-10s. The KC-46s are experiencing operational delays and deficiencies, all while downsizing our KC-135 fleet. The mobility capability requirement study of 2018, and again in 2020, both affirmed that 479 tankers were sufficient, but at a higher level of risk. General Van Ovos testified that U.S. Transcom's recent assessment indicates an inventory of 466 total aircraft as sufficient, but is elevated risk. Does the current law of 466 air refueling tankers meet the needs of the national defense strategy, or should we increase that to 479?
If I could quickly, on the Guard elements of the Space Force, they're not going anywhere. They're essential part of the Space Force. We're going to keep them. The argument we're having is about what label we put on them, but they're definitely going to stay. And the tankers, I think 466 is an adequate number. I think General Van Ovest is about to testify herself, and I think she should give you her views on that as well. And at the moment, what we're planning to do is essentially do a one-for-one swap out of KC-135s now and replace them with KC-46s.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. General Brown, last year's NDAA Section 155 asked for a plan on transferring KC-135 aircraft to air refueling wings of the Air National Guard that are classic associations with active duty units in the Air Force. Will we see this soon, and is there considerable cost to permanently transfer ownership of the 8 KC-135 aircraft to the 141st Air Refueling Wing? And has the Air Force considered flipping the association at Fairchild Air Force Base from the classic to the active association model?
We are working through that particular report. You should see that here in the coming weeks. And then in that report, we're working through a number of different options. It's probably, depending on what option you pick, will determine what that cost will be and how, the ability to be able to transfer like you described. So as we bring that forward to you, we'll be happy to have a dialogue with you and the rest of the committee on how best to move forward.
And I just thank all you gentlemen, but I'm have served as a traditional guardman for a lot of years, and I think it is so important that we recognize that we are not the strategic reserve of the 1980s and 1990s. We have become operational since the War on Terror, and I don't think that there's any way that big Air Force, big Army, the Marine Corps, or the Navy can operate without an operational reserve component. So I just ask your continued commitment, and that means equipping and manning and making sure we're resourcing those men and women who choose to to serve in a part-time capacity, that we continue to do that. And with my final question, I just want to go to, and it may be more of a statement than a question, but back in 2021, I expressed concerns at the speed at which the Air Force was moving with plans to retire the T-1A aircraft at Columbus Air Force Base and across the country. 2 years later, with T-7 aircraft production delayed to 2027, the Air Force has started retiring the T-1A aircraft. The Air Force should delay retiring an asset that would keep our prospective airmen and women flying and training until we have a full replacement. Do you agree with that statement?
The two aircraft are totally different, Congressman. The T-7 is a replacement for the T-38 basic trainer. The T-1 is an intermediate aircraft for people going on to multi-engine, and we're revising our training program for multi-engine so that it's just no longer necessary. So it's a completely different situation.
So you think divesting that not having the opportunity or something to train on until we get a replacement or something that is different, you're saying that it's okay to train? I mean, what do they train on then? What are the people who need that training?
Jim Brown can address this, but they'll train through simulators and then go to their platform that they can operate, which is the way the commercial airlines do it.
Simulators are great, but they're not flying an airplane. With that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I just want to start off by saying that I think the Air Force made the right decision in its FY24 budget request by fully funding the engine core upgrade for the F-135 engine. Decisions like this are made obviously with significant analysis that in this case resulted as a result of input from the Air Force, the Department of Defense, and with our international partners. Upgrading and modernizing the existing engine is undoubtedly the quickest, lowest risk, most cost-effective solution to enable F-35 Block 4 capabilities and provide a variant common capability across the entire fleet. And again, it's clear that that is particularly true for the sea services, who the ECU pathway is obviously the most aligned with the space constraints on aircraft carriers and large deck amphibious ships. Secretary Kendall, I wanted to ask you about the C-130 basing program right now. In the last administration, we watched this process just devolve into something that honestly was almost intelligible in terms of just, who was getting based, which states were getting based. With newly appropriated aircraft, the Air Force is now moving forward after developing and agreeing to a set of criteria for determining which installations are most fit to receive new aircraft. I have some concerns still just because of last administration's experience, and I just ask you to please, if you could, confirm for the committee that you're going to work with us and provide a completely fair and transparent process during your evaluation.
Thank you, Congressman Courtney. That decision's been delegated to the Chief of the Air National Guard, General Lowe. There are 8 bases, I think, that have been identified as potential candidates, and essentially we're going to field those C-130s at 4 of them. And there will be, he's using the strategic basing process that the Air Force uses routinely, and I can assure you that it will be a transparent and fair process.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Just a few days ago, I visited Collins Aerospace, where we were, again, getting an update on the C-130 propeller barrel issue and the industrial base capacity that was able to meet the demand and help us get into a good place to mitigate that issue. And Assistant Secretary Hunter testified about that actually last week. The industry was able to surge capacity to increase production rates so that we could get a get-well date for the C-130 fleet that actually was ahead of schedule, which is music to our ears. Again, I just wonder if you could talk about your perspective in terms of the work that industry did with this surge capacity and, again, just the general state of the program.
To be honest, that problem has fallen off my scope is one of the things I was tracking closely because they were making good progress on it. So I'm sure what Assistant Secretary Hunter had to say was accurate, and I'm glad that industry was able to respond so well.
I appreciate that. General Saltzman, again, I enjoyed speaking with you a month or so ago about where your branch is headed. Just to follow up with Mr. Smith's opening comments, yesterday I was under the impression that we were at least going to get a deeming budget component to the bill that was passed, but at this point that was not included. So we really now still have a budget process that's untethered to any sort of top line target that you can build appropriations 302B, funding for, and we're 4 months into this Congress at this point. And again, I know the chairman is determined to move forward, and we're going to get a top line to mark NDAA, but the appropriations process obviously is the one where CRs sort of emanate from, and considering the fact that the Space Force is almost entirely a new start from top to bottom, can you just sort of talk about what the impact would be to Space Force if this budget process doesn't get moving faster and we avoid a CR?
Well, we've made so much progress. I feel like organizing the kinds of equipment that we know we need, the kinds of training that I know the Guardians need to be successful in the emerging threat environment, that to slide back to FY22, we were a wholly different Space Force then. And so all of the progress that we made, I feel like would erode back to those early days of our capabilities and as Secretary Kendall has said, we lose time that we never get back in addressing the adversary. That's the most critical aspect, I think, that is lost in this.
And real quick, how many new starts are in the FY24 budget?
It depends on how you count it, but we have at least 7 that I count across the counter space portfolio.
And that's a big number for department your size. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Connecticut for allowing the general to make that observation. Chair now recognizes General Bacon from Nebraska.
Thank you, Chairman Rogers. We appreciate all 3 of you being here. Appreciate your testimony. Appreciate your leadership of the Air Force and the Space Force. My first question, but I want to sort of segue into quality of life, but I got a couple of questions up front that I'm hoping to get to. Secretary Kendall, I understand the pressures that the Air Force is under with new ICBMs, B-21s, F-35s, tankers, and with the current budget that we have, it sort of forces you into this divesting of 398 aircraft. But the cost is there because you're going to lose pilots, you're going to lose maintainers. It's about 20 squadrons worth of aircraft. And these aircraft still could have some use, say in the Middle East, perhaps not China. But my question to you is this: if Congress provided you additional funds for acquisition of new aircraft, is there capacity to produce more F-35s or more F-15EXs?
I don't know the answer to that question directly. I'd have to go check and get that for the record for you.
General Brown, would you by chance know?
Not off the top of my head, but here's part of I think part of their conversation is with our industry partners to determine what their capacity is, and then the aspects of some longer lead items that they'd have to invest in to be able to increase any type of production.
My thought is we have to do everything we can to give you more F-35s and F-15EXs, and over the fight up, we're going to be down 398 aircraft in total. It puts off a lot of red signals to me, and I'd like to help to try to fill that gap if we can. And I think it's also worth noting that the Air Force has about a 20% pass-through. In other words, 20% of all the money you get doesn't even go to you. It goes to other agencies that are not part of the Air Force. The Navy and the Army have about 1%. So when we look at your budget, it's not really the same as the other services. General Saltzman, a question for you. Regarding the missions like MILSATCOM and missile warning, do you feel our redundant, fixed, and mobile backup systems, so I'm talking about the backup, have the necessary level of manpower, system resiliency, and capabilities of our primary systems? And do we need to invest more in infrastructure and personnel for these backup systems?
I will tell you that we are currently capable in terms of manning and equipment for our existing missions. The problem, of course, is the emerging threat environment is going to change those conditions pretty rapidly. That's why shifting to a hybrid architecture where we are integrating commercial augmentation as well as proliferating our satellite communications architecture, that's going to change the nature of the business, which means we're going to have to look at backups differently. We're going to have to look at resiliency and redundancy a bit differently. For now, yes, but as the emerging threats change, we're going to have to shift.
There is no doubt that our primary adversaries will target our space in round one of any fight. And so we have to be resilient, redundant, survivable. So thank you. Where I want to really put the rest of our time is on quality of life. We're going to be standing up this panel in June. I'm looking forward to it. We hear about junior enlisted being on the SNAP program. I heard a lot from recent airmen about housing problems. So, General Brown, if I may, what's the primary quality of life issue that you hear about?
Well, I'll tell you, I get some personal feedback on a nightly basis from my wife, Shireen, on the areas that are important to military families. And with a group of spouses, they've started a look with a program called 5 and Thrive. It's really the aspect of the 5 things that impact military families. It's childcare, education, housing, healthcare, and spouse employment. And so I wouldn't give any one of them a priority because they're all important.
Yep.
And this is what we hear from our military families and our spouses. This is what I hear when I go home each evening. And the things that we need to do as a nation to support our military members and our families, because it helps our retention in the long run when we take care of those issues.
General Saltzman?
I would just add, I have a great wife at home too, who also, when she gets a chance to visit the bases, she brings back, she's my best sensor to be out there and talk to the families, talk to the spouses, and understand this. And I couldn't agree more with what General Brown said. Those are the issues. quite frankly, they've always been the issues. That's part of military service, is having to deal with some of those complications and those factors. I think now it's just about continuing to work them. As the dynamics change over time, we got to continue to work to make sure the families are taken care of as well.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, if I may just make a closing comment here. We work hard to figure out what is the right housing allowance. And then we say you only get 95%, and we keep 5% from our servicemen and women. I think that's unacceptable. I think Congress needs to fix that, Chairman, and give them the 100% of what they're owed. Thank you.
Well, you're going to be in a position to do something about that, General. I would urge y'all, as you know, General Bacon's going to be chairing the task force on quality of life for us. I would urge y'all to work with him, maybe have your spouses come and testify before his committee, because we're serious about getting after these things. And I love the idea of 5 and Thrive. Those are the 5 areas we need to be spending a lot of attention on. So thank you for that. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'm really glad to hear that we're going to be seeing that initiative through with General Bacon. So thank you very much. And I also want to associate myself with the remarks of the chairman and the ranking member about budgetary concerns, which of course are really a critique of us here in Congress, not at all of you. It's important that we get our budget act together to give you a predictable budget with which you can defend our nation. And it's also critical that we support the cuts that you want to make, because it's usually this committee, this body, that's the opposition that you face when it comes to making those investments of the future paid for by the cuts you need to make of old legacy systems that are out of date. So thank you for pursuing that. Secretary Kendall, could you please talk about some of the investments that you need to make in the Indo-Pacific to produce a more distributed and resilient posture, a better deterrent against the Chinese Communist Party, including force posture changes, and what you can do to accelerate these changes necessary to meet that threat?
A few months ago, the Deputy Secretary asked me what we could do most quickly to respond to our pacing challenge, and my answer was proliferation and hardening of our bases in the Pacific. Under the operational imperatives that we've talked about, number 5 was resiliency of our forward air bases, and moving the concept called agile combat employment, the idea that we don't stay on one fixed base that's very easy to target, but that we use alternative bases and distribute our assets and move them around so they're harder to target. To support that, you need a combination of hardening, pre-positioning of equipment, mobility assets, defenses, deception capabilities, all of these things. And we did a number of months of analysis to try to define the best mix of those, and we put a lot of that into our budget. So in FY24, we are in particular asking for things that would provide a measure of hardening and will provide pre-positioned equipment to support those kinds of operations. We're also working with Indo-PACOM on opening up more bases that can be used through a combination of MILCON and use of organic resources to restore bases that have been not been kept up. And we're practicing this. We're doing a lot under ACE to make people capable of doing this sort of thing.
General
So
Brown.
that kind of mix of things. The one thing that we're not funding out of the Air Force is active defenses. And there's a study ongoing in the department led by the Army right now to try to determine what are the most cost-effective defenses we could in place.
General Brown, General Saltzman, could you briefly add what are your top priorities and what can Congress here do to accelerate them in the Pacific?
Very quickly, as Secretary outlined, it's a resilient foreign basing, and these are the aspects of pre-positioning, the capability to be able to pre-position, as also upgrading some of the facilities, the ability to harden, the ability to add in deception. But it's also the training of our airmen in some of these areas to be multi-capable. It's been a focus of ours as well, of being able not only for the airmen, it's the mindset, but it's also how they train and having the capabilities to do that in an environment different from what we've done in the Middle East for the past several decades, but more focused on being light, lean, and agile.
General Saltzman, anything to add for the Space Force?
Very similar to General Brown. We're shifting to resilient architectures, which makes it harder to target those capabilities, makes them more survivable. But then our Guardians will have to be trained. We've lived in a benign space environment for so many years that we have to shift our thinking, and that means also shifting our training concepts so that our Guardians have the tools and tactics they need to be successful.
Great, thank you. Secretary Kendall, the B-21 has been hailed as an acquisition success story. That's a rare term to hear in these parts. What can we do to learn from that program and apply it to other acquisition programs?
I think it's a little too early to call it a success story. It's made good progress. It's stayed very close to schedule. and we expect to get the first flight later this year, but we still have a long way to go in the development program. All new development programs are inherently risky. When Dr. LaPlante and I laid out this program when I was in my previous position, and he was Assistant Secretary of the Air Force, we structured it to manage the risks so we have a good chance of success. We also have, I think, a very competent program office through their RCO, which has managed the program very hands-on and very aggressively. And so far, the contractor, the prime, seems to be performing reasonably well. It's a mix of those things that come together to allow a program to succeed. But I can't say enough that new development, particularly of cutting-edge designs, is inherently risky. And all you can do is set up your program in a way which is thoughtful and tries to manage those risks. And that's what we tried to do with this program, and so far it's bearing out.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Banks, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Kendall, the Air Force is projected to fall short by 10% of its recruitment goals this year. That's better than the Army and the Navy, but it's still concerning, affecting pilots and maintainers and others. What's the Air Force's plan to do something about it?
We have a full court press on this. The Vice Chairman of the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Alvin, is leading a Tiger team that General Brown and I have asked him to put together to address some of the barriers to entry, to try to relax some of those without changing our standards, and to cut through bureaucracy and make that happen very quickly. Those efforts are bearing fruit. We are benefiting from being back in the schools where we couldn't be under COVID for a while, so that's helping. We're seeing some changes in the trajectory that are positive, and we're hoping now that we can be under 10%, but we're still expect to fall short by the end of the year. The Guard and Reserves are having more significant problems than we are. Overall, what we're finding is that there's a lower propensity to serve in the military, and that's largely because people just aren't aware of what the military has to offer. They're not familiar with it. All of this, I'm sorry there aren't more people still in the room to hear this, but all of us should be talking to the communities we can address, and this includes members of Congress, to let them know about what the military has to offer, to create a positive narrative. We offer people interesting work. We offer them work on cutting edge of technology. We offer them the chance to serve their nation, to support a higher calling, a higher mission, and to prepare themselves for whatever else they do with the rest of their lives, whether it's stay in the military, go on and do something else. It's a way to move your life forward. And we're finding that people who come in are staying. We're doing very well on retention. But right now we have a problem with basically communicating to the American people, particularly the young people, and in some cases perhaps their parents, that the military has a lot to offer. And I would say that in particular of the high-quality, high-tech oriented services like the Air Force and the Space Force. Do you want to add anything to that?
I want to move on. I do want to applaud you, Mr. Secretary, for not weakening your standards. I think that's very important. And your commitment to us, I think, not to do that is important. The Air Force has reportedly decided to end the Air-Launched Rapid Response Weapon, or the ARRW, hypersonic program and instead focus on a hypersonic cruise missile, which the Air Force won't field until later this decade. Mr. Secretary, has the Air Force's requirement for an air-launched hypersonic weapon grown less urgent in the past year?
The Air Force wants hypersonics in its inventory, but we're trying to reinforce success here. HACM has made some progress, and of the two mission capabilities, which are quite different, HACM, we think, offers the most potential to us at this point. We haven't stopped on Aero. We still have funds to complete the test program, and we'll reserve judgment till we see how that does, and we'll look at our priorities going forward. But at the moment, HACM
when
is like
when is the earliest that the committee can expect the HACM to be fielded?
I can get that date for you for the record. It's still a few years out, but I don't recall what it is.
You don't have a good estimate or guess of how early that would be?
I think it's the late 2000s, 20s.
And what steps is the department taking to expedite the fielding of the HACM?
We're trying to move through the test program as efficiently as we can at this point.
No steps? Anything specific?
We don't want to take a lot of risk on
NDAA to speed it
concurrency. Any hypersonic weapon system has a lot of risk in it, so we want to, in any case, demonstrate the performance before we commit to production.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Carbajal, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. As you all may know, I represent the 24th Congressional District, which is home to Vandenberg Space Force Base and our nation's West Coast Range. Not to mention, many people call it paradise, which I'm sure many of you know. Vandenberg is uniquely situated on the coast making it one of the best locations in the world to launch into polar orbit. Vandenberg is also 118,000 acres larger than all other Space Force bases combined, and has 16 launch sites currently. General Saltzman, how important is it to have an East and West Coast range, especially from a strategic forces and readiness standpoint?
I think you know the answer. It's critical, of course.
I'd just like to hear it.
I know you do, sir. Thank you. Yes, sir. Having access on both the East and the West Coast gives us tremendous agility and launch azimuths, as you well know, the different kinds of payloads, the different kind of orbits that we can take advantage of. So the resiliency that it creates by having two different launch ranges, as well as the vantage point that looking west across the ocean there does. So it's critical.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure our chairman understood that as well. I was pleased to finally see the Spaceport of the Future legislative proposal, which is important in addressing critical infrastructure needs at Vandenberg, and particularly to meet the NSSL Phase 3 requirements. General Saltzman, given the importance of a robust West Coast range, can you explain your investment strategy for the launch infrastructure at Vandenberg and how the Spaceport of the Future legislative proposal complements your investment strategy?
The legislative proposal is key because what we're seeing is such a dramatic increase in use of the launch ranges that our infrastructure is suffering. And so we could continue to invest and invest, but we have other priorities, the counter space priorities addressing threats, modernization, et cetera. So we needed a mechanism to allow us to properly invest and support the commercial activities, and I think the new legislative proposal has found a way for us to recoup some of those indirect costs, provide the infrastructure that commercial launch providers need, support the emerging market and the new entrants to the launch business.
Thank you. Hundreds of guardsmen in California operate space missions for the Air Force and Army. Vandenberg Space Force Base has CalGuard squadrons with space missions. General Saltzman, General Hokanson has said routinely that he assesses that establishing a Space National Guard would have no impact to readiness, require no new facilities, and incur only minimal costs, such as changing name tapes and guidelines. Is this also your assessment?
Well, first, let me just say that those capabilities in the Guard are critical, and we have to figure out a way to maintain them. So we're in a little bit of a status quo problem with General Brown still having the organized, train, equip with General Hokanson and General Lowe on how to organize, train, equip for those space missions, but we've transferred all of the expertise and capacity for training and equipping over to the Space Force. So status quo doesn't really work for us. There are advantages to a Space National Guard, but there are also advantages to thinking how you can incorporate those capabilities in other ways. We are actively going through the analysis process to figure out what's the best benefit to the government.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from California. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bergman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Kendall, I was going to start by asking you want the good news or the bad news first. We'll just go with the bad news, okay? And then because I got good news. 13 years, PFAS, Wurtsmith Air Force Base, Oscoda, Michigan, part of my district now as of a couple of years ago in the redistricting, and we're still years away from having a final cleanup plan. The reason that's been given is we got to do more testing. We know the PFAS is in the ground. We could test to the point of infinite. It's like separating fly manure from pepper. At the end, you got two piles, and it's tough to discern which is which. You still got to take action appropriately. Will the Air Force commit to stop the flow of PFAS into public waterways and contain it within the boundaries of the base as it existed when it was a base without further delay? We've done enough testing. Testing is going to be ongoing, but can you commit that the Air Force will actually stop whatever flow is still going on and the rest of it is going to happen naturally?
Congressman Bergman, I think that the current posture is that we don't interject any more PFAS into the environment. We still have it available, I think, for emergencies in some cases, but we're moving away from it entirely. I think we've got a
So
recent
you
decision to do that.
think.
I will double check the exact status for you. I want to
Because that, been 13 years. And
I
the point is,
understand.
we all agree that it is in the system. Nobody's laying blame, you know, it happened, it occurred. But the idea is if we right now, I believe there's, as a result, the state and local health departments have issued 5 separate public health warnings in the not too, you know, recent past. So we need a commitment from the Air Force to say, we are going to focus on any flow of any material that's aboard the confines of the old base. That would go a long way towards helping the residents and the businesses who are in the local area build the confidence.
And we're committed to addressing this problem. We've been waiting primarily, we were doing the assessments. And
Done,
waiting,
we've
been waiting for
time. Assessing, it's time to take the plane airborne, if you will, and take it a different way. Eventually, unless you're aero refueling forever, you're going to eventually run out of gas, and you're going to, you know, you're on a glide path right now as the Air Force when it comes to action in this. Okay.
Yeah, we're waiting. I think EPA has a final standard out for review, and that, we've been waiting for that for some time. As soon as that process...
I will look forward to an update. I don't want to waste my time because I want to give you some good news. Okay, General Brown, you know, in last week's Air Force hearing on aviation programs, I submitted a question for the record on milestones of a pilot's career. Specifically, I'd like to see how long we have a fully capable, combat deployable, trained pilot ready, you know, ready to go to the fight from the time that they get their wings, transition to an aircraft, join an operational squadron. How much time do we have them before we have to consider retention? Is it 2 years? You don't have to answer it now. We did that. I did that for the record. I just like to get an example of that timeline because you know how long it takes the pilot to go through all those stages, and then you know when their initial contract ends. That would be helpful. The good news, the way the Air Force does its pilot training and has it down to a science of when you check in and you go through the stages, you have been the most accurate of services in setting the expectations for those student pilots, and I commend you for that. The Army is a close second, and unfortunately, the Navy is an extremely distant third. So I would suggest potentially that whatever you're doing in the Air Force, if you could maybe have a conversation down the hall in the Pentagon, it might be helpful for that. But I wanted to just, again, if you're doing it right, keep doing it. But now we're looking at, as you already talked about here, and other things with the retention of pilots. But we're concerned of how long are they in the hot seat, ready to go to the fight tonight. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Escobar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today and for your service. Secretary Kendall, you and I have had great conversations around the work happening in my community, El Paso, Texas, Fort Bliss, but also with the University of Texas at El Paso. I have long worked to ensure that we are creating not just an economic development engine that capitalizes on our advanced manufacturing, our 3D printing, and our aerospace engineering programs at UTEP, but have worked to make sure that we are a strong supporter of our national defense. And I have long spoken about the need for us to further capitalize on the brilliance of our research institutions, and really enjoyed our conversation about that the other day, Secretary Kendall. I have a question about personnel management for you. You've identified enacting a Space Force Personnel Management Authority to offer a new model of service to the nation, and that's a priority, and it's a priority right now when we have seen a decline in public propensity to serve. Can you elaborate on this authority, the benefits that this effort can provide to ensure that we develop and sustain a diverse, dynamic workforce, And can you speak to the ways it addresses some of the publicly perceived barriers to service that have plagued recruitment across the military services?
Thank you, Congressman Escobar. I think you're referring to the initiative from the Space Force to create a single component where people can serve actively full-time or part-time and be part of essentially the same institution. General Saltzman spent a lot of time after he came into office working on the details of that. We had submitted a similar proposal last year, and Congress asked us to go back and study it some more. I think we've got a fairly well thought-out, thorough proposal now that will be practical, and we'll be able to apply it, and it'll confer some big benefits on us. It'll give people a lot more flexibility. They'll be able to serve their nation, but also, do other things at certain times of their lives when that's what they need to do. So the flexibility, I think, will help, and it'll help us retain, both acquire and retain talent. I think it'll have a very major benefit.
That's fantastic. General Saltzman, anything you'd like to add?
The Secretary covered the key aspects of it. It's about flexibility and a career path. We think that's what the modern military member is looking for, right? They have this desire to serve, but sometimes full-time service isn't exactly what they need. So having options like a part-time path where you can come in and come out, that permeability is also very valuable to retain the talent that we need.
Thank you so much. And this next question is for Secretary Kendall and General Brown. The fiscal year 24 budget request for the Space Force has been identified by the service as one that pivots toward resilient architectures and embodies an integrated deterrence approach to enable the Space Force's ability to operate in a highly contested environment. Does your budget request support digital open architecture engineering, which the private sector has developed and continues to test through the industrial base, both in El Paso and nationally? And can you speak to the benefits that digital open architecture engineering provides as we prioritize rapid system development?
It's an improvement in engineering practice and in program management that allows much more efficient development to occur. In particular, in a situation where you have an organization like the government as a customer working with contractors. What started to some degree with the B-21, but it's been done on other programs. It's being done on Next Generation Air Dominance now very effectively, and we're seeing it in other plaplaces. And we're picking this up from the commercial world to a certain extent. But you have a single environment. People can work on it together. You have a much more fluid interaction between people, which makes you much more efficient. And you're allowed to move data back and forth. You share a database. You share a computing environment. And then the design approach itself uses digital models which are much more sophisticated than traditionally, so that you can move through a lot of design iterations very quickly. It's a fairly substantial improvement. I've tried to get a quantitative estimate of what kind of an improvement it is. People have talked about factors. I think it's more like a 20-25% kind of an improvement, but that's significant, and it reduces risk substantially on our programs to be able to do this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. General Brown, anything to add?
The one thing I'd add is as I talk to our acquisition professionals is the aspect of because they're able to work in a digital environment, they don't have to wait to a big critical design review to actually sit down and pour through paperwork. They can actually kind of do it real time, well ahead of the timeline, which saves time and then gets us in a better place in the long run.
Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Saltzman, when we actually was with General Thompson, but discussed with me extensively your need for simulation centers, your need to be able to basically train like you're going to fight, and the facilities, you need to do that. Mr. Secretary, and that's a real need, and we need to get that to you sooner than later. Mr. Secretary, what's the update that you can give with STARCOM and that basing decision?
It's pending, Senator Congressman Waltz.
It's been pending.
It's pending. It should be.
How long is it going to be pending?
I hope we'll be able to announce that fairly soon.
Soon as in months, or?
I would hope so.
Okay, great. We'll look forward to that, and obviously, I don't think I need to remind you again, and thank you for the conversations on it, that the Orlando area has some of the world-class simulation centers, and that aside from our geography and launch capability, it's the people and the generations of space professionals that we have in that area. So we'll look forward to that decision. General Saltzman, you mentioned a moment ago about facilitating and lowering barriers for new entrants into launch. And we're on a trajectory now to go from several thousand satellites in orbit to nearly 100,000 over the next decade. I don't see how we get that many launches up to support what we need in the proliferated architecture. I mean, you need help. And my question is, and I'm trying to figure out, is on those range services, those day of launch services, why is the Space Force involved in commercial, not national security, but commercial launches and providing those services and getting reimbursed then by commercial providers? Why aren't we opening that up to other commercial providers that can provide those same day of launch services?
Yeah, part of it is the way we built the ranges, the way we've built our policies and procedures around protecting the ranges, the safety associated with the ranges. It probably does warrant us going back and relooking to say, now that there are commercial entities that are capable of providing complete end-to-end launch services, does there need to be a relook at the model?
FCC has 60 to 65,000 applications, a backlog, right? That's 65,000 birds waiting to go up. If you figure a Falcon 9 can put up 50, like, do the math how long that's going to take. And I talked to the folks at Boca Chica, and they're wondering, why am I reimbursing the Space Force for commercial launch when I could be reimbursing and dealing with commercial companies that can help us move faster? So I would encourage you, and the committee, I think, is happy to work with you on how to open that aperture. And by the way, it's in law. Years ago, when these real capabilities didn't exist, but now they do, for you to certify that those capabilities don't exist before the U.S. government takes on that function. So I'd certainly encourage you to take a hard look at that. And then, Mr. Secretary, in my time remaining, I'm concerned about our plan or lack thereof to recap the Air National Guard fleet. And when I say that, I mean the A-10s, F-15 Charlies, F-16s. That's a lot of capability and ecosystem and infrastructure that's obviously fixed to that geographic location. Can you talk to me about a recap plan for the Air Guard?
First of all, Congressman Waltz, the Air Guard provides a very important part of our overall department. The capabilities that come out of the Guard and the quality of those units and the cost effectiveness of them is quite good. I've had a chance to visit a number of those units. I've been really impressed by the professionalism that I've seen. As we transform the Air Force to the Air Force we're going to need in the future, we want to have a healthy Guard and a healthy reserve and a healthy active component, which are in balance. And as someone else mentioned earlier, to an extent I didn't realize when I came into office, both the Guard and the reserves are part of our operations to a larger extent than I thought.
30% of the fighter fleet. Right, 30% of the fighter fleet, and at least, not to cut you off, Mr. Secretary, but from the plans I've seen, 18, 19 of the 25 Air Guard fighter squadrons are going to be essentially kind of moved out of business as you modernize. So can you come back to and work with me and work with the committee on a plan there? And then just final question for the record, can you also come back to me on the obstacles that are preventing accelerated delivery of the 66 F-16s to Taiwan? I sit on both Foreign Affairs and Armed Services, and I want to work with the service on how to accelerate that.
Chair, now recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. McLean, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. It's good to see you again. I want to focus today a little bit about the recruiting and the recruiting goals and really what I'm seeing in my district, and I'm hearing from my district. As you know, General Brown, I think it was last year, you and I had a conversation about we're not meeting our recruiting goals, and some of our positions didn't get filled. So I took that to heart, and I went back and did a little research and started talking to some of the people in my district. How far are we off on the Air Force recruiting goal? How far was it? Still around 15,000?
No, it's about 10%. So on the active side, it's about 2,500 or so, a little higher on the Guard and Reserve. I would say partly the challenge with the Guard and Reserve is because our attention is really good on the active side right now, about 90% plus or minus on officer and enlisted, which means you don't have airmen leaving the active force going into the Guard and Reserve. And so we've made some changes in reducing the barrier to entry with not impacting the standards. And part of the other aspect is just the familiarity with the with military service.
And can you share and talk a little bit about what steps that y'all are using to boost the recruiting efforts?
Sure. The first thing I would highlight is I often say that young people only aspire to be what they see. And if they never see our United States Air Force, they are not inclined to grow up to join the United States Air Force. And so part of that is how do we better engage in our communities? I gave a letter to all of our wing commanders about 2 months ago to tell them to get into the communities and open up their bases and get re-engaged. I would say the same thing with our recruiters to get them back into the high schools now that we've gotten past COVID. And this is where, for members, as you go back to your community, in some cases, encouraging them to open up the high schools. We do have good opportunities in some places. Some places it's a little bit more challenging. But I think we're making progress based on some changes we made, and we're seeing some of that happen throughout the course of the past several months.
You're seeing numbers go up?
We are. We did some things to change some policies that were a bit more restrictive than the other services, and that's helped us to increase our numbers. And because originally we were about 15%, and we're down. We're going to be probably less than 10% by the time we get to the end of the fiscal year.
Okay. As I talk to the people in my district, as I talk to the people in the community, and as I've done some research, in fact, Heritage Foundation did a study, and nearly 70% of the active duty service members have witnessed really a politicization of the military. And whether we think it's a problem, we feel that it's the study and the data that Heritage did, and I can give that to you, shows that the military being political is just, it's not positive. And it hurts. It hurts morale, it hurts pride. And I talk to men and women and families and in my district, and they feel that they lost a sense of pride. They feel like the woke agenda isn't helping. We talk too much about diversity, equity, and inclusion when I'm all for diversity, equity, inclusion, but I think the most diverse and equity and inclusive that we can be is for the individual. And from what I've heard and what I've seen is we've gone from the individual to a small percentage of folks that we focus on. And I have in front of me, the slides on the diversity training and the equity and the inclusion training. How much money and time do we really spend on that? Can we get a better sense to help educate everyone?
I can provide you, exact information for the record, but I will tell you, most of our training and most of our focus is on the readiness of the force. And part of that readiness of the force is to ensure that we're building cohesive teams, and part of those cohesive teams is to get to know our airmen to left and our right.
And I appreciate that. And one of the things it talks about in one of your slides is not to recognize people as moms and dads. I mean, as a mother, I take a little bit of offense to that. It also talks about not using the word terrorist. Can you explain why we wouldn't use the word terrorist and mom and dad? I think you got to get that message out, because I think a lot of people are really frustrated and they feel like we're polarizing as opposed to coming together.
What I would tell you is that what I perceive is we're misreading some of the aspects of the things we're trying to do as we move the Air Force forward, and we look at how we build cohesive teams. And so part of the building the cohesive teams is getting to know our airmen. And
Gentleman's time's expired. Our gentle lady's time has
Thank you.
expired. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Davis.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair, and to our ranking member and to the Secretary. So good to see you, Secretary Kendall and General Brown and General Saltzman. Thank you for joining us today. Ensuring a ready fighting force in the air is paramount. And we've heard comments today, which I outline, and that is when it comes down to deterring military aggression, especially from the People's Republic of China and other belligerent nations. Mr. Secretary, based on procurement justification documents, the Air Force has F-15Es and a divestment plan that would shrink the F-15E from 218 aircraft to about 99. And I want to raise a concern that I've been hearing quite a bit these days regarding this divestment plan. And I just want to understand when it comes to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in particular, my understanding there would not be necessarily the capability of bringing in F-35s there. But would there be an intent to eliminate 2 of the squadrons there at all?
Congressman, I believe that what we're trying to do is there's a mission shift occurring, Seymour Johnson, if I remember right. And the comments were made earlier about some of this and about the fighters. What we're trying to acquire is the most combat power that we can acquire given the resources that we have. And part of that is getting 5th-generation fighters. Part of that is getting on with the 6th-generation set of capabilities. Part of it is shifting our force to stronger capabilities in areas like electronic warfare, cyber capabilities, ISR in general, things that are going to be very important on a future battlefield.
But let me ask, as we're making that shift, would there be necessarily a gap that would exist in terms of our current fleet that's retired and this new fleet that may come in?
There can be, but we try to make that a manageable gap depending upon the situation. And my conversations with people
When you
involved
say
in
manageable gap, what exactly would
on the order of 1 to
manageable
2
mean?
years.
I'm sorry?
On the order of 1 to 2 years if possible. So that you can make a reasonable transition and not have, a very negative effect. What we're trying to do overall, particularly with guard bases, is if there's a fighter mission already, we try to replace it with a fighter mission. If we can't do that, then we try to replace it with a flying mission. If we can't do that, then we try to find a suitable mission that is a high priority to the Air Force, which will have a lot of longevity on that base and provide a lot of benefits to the community. So that's essentially our hierarchy, and generally so far we've been able to do that. And I'd be happy to get with you offline and talk to you about whatever long-term plans we have for Seymour Johnson.
And let me follow up on this then. If you said 1 or 2 years in terms of possibility of managing the gap, would there be, in your opinion, a possibility of not having even that period, or?
It depends on the situation. My personal opinion is that given the severity of the threat that we're facing, as time goes on, we're going to be acquiring more rather than less. But I have to look at what is within our constraints right now when we do our detailed planning.
Yeah, and I can share with you the concern of reducing that period, if not eliminating the gap period. But I would really welcome an opportunity to follow up with this.
We'd work with you on that.
Yeah, and I want to also follow up on another topic too. I spoke briefly about, and I've continued to share with all the witnesses this come before to advocate for Northeast and North Carolina in particular, Elizabeth City State University, historically black college university in this community. It's isolated, and they're doing amazing work with ROTC, with the Aerospace Studies, Aerosciences program. And we really would like to see an Air Force ROTC, Space Force ROTC program. It's isolated, it's not easy to enter across town, and I'm just trying to understand in cases like this where communities already built synergy, how can we better connect to these pipelines?
That's a good question, and I'd be happy to look at that opportunity with you. We are trying to build up our science and engineering capacity in general. ROTC is a big feeder, obviously, for our capabilities there, and we're very interested in increasing diversity in that part of the force. So I'd be happy to work with you on that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. My final comment, I'm really proud of Warren County High School. We're one of the few Space Force JROTC programs, and I'm proud of that. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
What a great note. Chair, now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Dr. Jackson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The Department of the Air Force is in the midst of a difficult balancing act, just like everyone else in the Department of Defense right now, in maintaining a force that's equipped to fight today while developing a force that will fight tomorrow. This is no easy task, and difficult decisions have to be made, and many are still to come. But one thing is clear, we're quickly running out of time. Indecision is a luxury we can no longer afford. Both the Air and Space Force must field capabilities and capacities now that will protect today while maintaining relevance in the future. Superiority in air and space is vital, but we're moving in the wrong direction in my mind in some cases, and this must change. We're going to have to do better if we're going to deter and defeat the PRC. General Brown, I have a question here. I'll just start off by saying I have concerns with the massive investments being made in the 6th-generation platforms right now, while we are simultaneously failing to field a capable trainer that meets the needs of our young aviators for 5th-generation platforms. Pilots at Shepherd Air Force Base in my district are currently training in the T-38, a trainer that's older than many members of this committee, including myself. Just a few days ago, initial operational capability for the T-7 was delayed again until the spring of 2027, which puts us 2 years behind where we should be and where we were. While the timeline for a conflict with China continues to accelerate, we need to be training on modern aircraft to ensure our Air Force is ready to dominate the adversary. General Brown, what is the Air Force doing to overcome these delays and help our industry partners get the T-7 to bases like Shepherd more quickly? And how are we ensuring that that we end this never-ending cycle of bad news on our new platforms like the T-7 trainer?
Representative Jackson, one of my focus areas is to ensure that not only do we have the combat capability, but we also have to build the training pipeline for our airmen to get to that combat capability. And so my focus has been on areas to include, as we look at the T-7 and the longevity of the T-38. I sat down with our staff here just this past week, and actually I just met with the civic leaders from Shepherd. They were in my office here earlier this week, where we had this very conversation. And it's the aspect of we've had success when I personally engage with their industry leaders and sit down with them. I just did it this week on one of our platforms to get us all in the same room, same level of focus, to work through the issues that we know and make sure we're not talking past each other, but we together have to solve these problems to make sure we bring the capability that our airmen require, one, to be trained, and then two, to be ready to get to that credible combat capability.
Right, yes, sir, I appreciate that, and thank you for taking the time to talk to them. And they're also concerned because they train most of our NATO fighter pilots, and they're worried about that pipeline drying up because of the delays and going somewhere else, so that's a big concern for us. Second question, on October 31st, 2020, 4 CV-22s completed the longest distance nighttime hostage rescue mission in U.S. history. The long range and vertical lift of the CV-22 made it possible for Air Force crews to fly SEAL team operators thousands of miles from Rota, Spain to Nigeria to rescue an American hostage. The speed, versatility, and range of the CV-22 is unique in the Air Force inventory and across the Joint Force, in fact. This aircraft gives our special operators unique capabilities that we have really come to rely on. A future conflict in Indo-Pacific presents unique environmental challenges and vast distances that only currently in the Air Force the CV-22 will be able to overcome. While the program of record for the CV-22 has been fulfilled, I have to imagine that future mission sets will need the unique capabilities of this platform as well. General Brown, has the Air Force given consideration to procuring additional CV-22 aircraft to increase the capacity or evaluated the aircraft that will be tasked to accomplish these missions? And is there any thought as to what might replace this aircraft in Indo-Pacific in particular? And I would just finish before you answer your question by saying I think a great alternative might be the Army's new future vertical lift, the V-280. You should look at that as well. But your thoughts on that?
You actually hit the nail on the head there, because I think that's the aspect I don't see us actually going to additional CV-22s and opening back, because once you shut down a production line, it's very expensive to start back up. And oh, by the way, it's technology that's somewhat dated. So looking to the future at the Army's platform, there's other industry partners that are actually going down this path as well. These are the kinds of things we are looking at as an Air Force, not only for what the CV-22 is able to do for this hostage rescue, but also for personnel recovery and other aspects of logistics in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, thanks, sir. And the V-280 is a great platform. I've spent a lot of time looking at it because Bell Helicopters in my district as well. I think the Army made a great decision on that. I'd love to talk to you more about getting the Air Force up and running on that as well, because I think, like you said, once that pipeline is no longer working, then we lose the ability to really catch up if we need to. Thank you, sir. I yield back, sir.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Vasquez, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Kendall, Generals Brown and Saltzman, for taking the time to speak with us today. I represent Holloman Air Force Base in southern New Mexico. That's home to the 49th Wing and boasts some of the largest protected airspace in the country. Holloman also hosts the largest training unit of F-16s and MQ-9s in the country, and we proudly produce hundreds of combat-ready pilots every year, many of whom I met on a visit to Holloman Air Force Base just last month. But anxiety continues to loom for places and communities that are rural, just like Alamogordo. And in 2010, when we saw the deactivation of the 2 F-22 squadrons and we were passed over for the F-35 mission, there continues to be anxiety about the future of Holloman Air Force Base. General Brown I know that Holloman is key to our national defense and our local and our rural economy. Do you believe Holloman is a critical Air Force base, and if so, why?
But I think you've highlighted some of the key aspects because of the training we do there with the R-16 to the other MQ-9, but also the airspace in that area. Having flown there in my early in my career, one of my fighter lead in training, but also having flown through there and used the airspace in and surrounding Alamogordo and Holloman Air Force Base. So I do see that it's vital, and we've coming to put the F-16s in there is an indication that how important we think Holloman is in the surrounding airspace.
Great, General. Thank you so much for agreeing with me on that. So recognizing how important Holloman is to our national security, I want to highlight some of the struggles that our service members and their families are dealing with in the district. During my visit to Holloman, I learned that we're facing a shortage of over 70 child care workers for their child development centers. There's a waiting list of over 120 families who need to get child care, and of course that means that their spouse or dependent cannot go to work and cannot earn additional income if they don't have the ability to have child care. And recently, out of 300 designated military housing areas, Holloman was just one amongst the 4 locations that received a decrease in benefits for basic allowance for housing, even amidst deteriorating conditions at the barracks there at Holloman. With a reduction in benefits and proposed cuts to the overall defense budget that we just saw, I think we're moving in the wrong direction. Service members are struggling to make ends meet, and the Department of Defense is facing recruitment challenges. It needs to be a top priority for the Department to prioritize the quality of life for our brave service members. Without this prioritization, we can't recruit the pilots that we need for all the aircraft that we're talking about today. Secretary Kendall, what steps is the Air Force planning to take to ensure we provide our airmen with rewarding, not just adequate, but rewarding benefits that help recruitment and a good quality of life for their service, especially in rural areas like Alamogordo?
Yeah, I think General Brown covered a lot of that when he talked about 5 and Thrive. The things on that list are really important to us. First on the list of airmen I talked to is child care, thing that you mentioned. We're doing a number of things to try to improve, and there has been improvement. We've moved from a 65% or so capacity utilization up to about 75%. And that's about staffing. And one of the things we did there was the department put out a guidance that we could cover up half of a staff member's first child for their cost of child care. We went to 100%, and we added 25% in addition for others. So we're doing things to create incentives for people to provide staffing to us. We're doing things to provide incentives for people to provide more capability to us. And we are building some new centers as well. So we're trying to attack that problem across the board. It's very high on the list of quality of life considerations for us. I would say housing was probably next, but all the things that General Brown mentioned are important to our families, and we're working on all of them.
Well, Secretary, I appreciate that, and I did hear of those very generous benefits to our child care workers that they receive, but I also heard that they're not good enough, that they're still not achieving the results that we need, and that we've had a chance to test out those benefits, and they're still not enough. And so I'd like to see us be more innovative in the approach to recruitment for these positions, in addition to just the benefits, because what we've seen at Holloman is that they're not the silver bullet. They haven't had the intended effect and impact that I think we'd like to have. Just to follow up, if we were to fund the defense budget at FY22 levels, what impact would that have on the lives of airmen and their families?
It would put them at risk. I mean, the first obligation we have to our airmen and their families is to provide them with the weapons that they need to do their job successfully. And I mentioned earlier, delaying our modernization programs puts our airmen and at risk and our guardians. There are also obvious impacts on things like quality of life and housing and education and all sorts of other things. But fundamentally, we want them to be in a position where if we ask them to go into combat, that they're going to win. And if we don't move forward with modernization, we're not going to be able to do that.
Secretary, thank you. With that, I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from the great state of Alabama.
Thank you, Chairman
Strong for
Rogers.
5 minutes.
I thank our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. Air Force Secretary selects Huntsville, Alabama as preferred location to host U.S. Space Command. This press release was published by the Air Force 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days ago. After a strategic basing process that dates back to December 2018, the Air Force selected Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama as the preferred location for the United States Space Command headquarters. The Air Force made this selection following assessments of site visits, factors related to mission, infrastructure, capacity, community support, and the cost to the Department of Defense. It's also going up on the screen. I want to highlight a specific line. And I quote, we got this? And I quote, Huntsville compared favorably across more of these factors than any other community, providing a large, qualified workforce, quality schools, superior infrastructure capacity, and low initial and reoccurring cost, end quote. Secretary Kendall, out of 6 candidate locations, do you know which location had the highest final score for the set factors and criteria?
You talking about the previous analysis, Congressman?
Yes.
I believe I do.
It was Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, with 9 criteria in the top 3rd ranking. Based on those same criteria, do you know how Peterson Space Force Base fared?
I do not recall how Peterson fared.
Well, let me help you. Peterson had 5 criteria in the top 3rd, 6 in the middle, and 10 in the bottom criteria. Immediately following the Air Force's announcement on January the 13th of 2021, our friends out west sent a letter to the President-elect asking him, and I quote, reverse the decision. And then again on January the 26th, requesting President Biden to conduct, I quote, a thorough review, close quote, of the decision, and again, quote, suspend any action to relocated headquarters, close quote, until the review was completed. They did not say what is best for national security. They said reverse the decision. On February the 19th, 2021, the Department of Defense Inspector General's office opened an investigation on the Space Command basing decision. The Government Accountability Office followed suit exactly 1 month later. The GAO report included the following statement regarding the evaluation phase, and I quote, there was a sizable break between the top 2 scoring locations and the 3rd place location. Mr. Secretary, I know you're familiar with these rankings. They're going up on the screen again. Just for the record, which sites were the Air Force's top 2 locations during this evaluation phase?
I think you have it on the screen, Congressman.
Thank you. It's correct. Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Again, just for the record, what was Colorado's rank during the evaluation phase?
I think you have that on the screen also.
That's right. They were 4th. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I know you're also familiar with the selection phase. I want to put these rankings on the screen as well. For the record, which site was the Air Force's top preference during the selection phase?
That's on the screen, Congressman.
Thank you. Redstone Arsenal, Huntsville, Alabama. The DoD Inspector General report, which was published on May 10th, 2021, stated that the Air Force's basing process for Space Command headquarters, and I quote, complied with law and policy and was reasonable in identifying Huntsville, Alabama as the preferred location. And just to make it clear, that same report also was quoted saying, therefore, the ranking of Colorado as the preferred permanent location was not supportable. Redstone Arsenal was the top site for the U.S. Space Command headquarters throughout the entire process. That is a fact. The report attempting to overturn the decision requested by the Colorado delegation proved that the Air Force's process was unbiased and reasonable. That is another fact. Mr. Secretary, in May of 2022, you testified that you were hoping to move forward with a final decision as quickly as you could. Last month, you testified you're expecting a decision fairly soon. Why on earth have we not received a final decision regarding U.S. Space Command headquarters?
Gentleman's time's expired. As much as I would love to allow him to go on, I must move on to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Veazey.
Mr. Chairman, I've got a series of unanimous consent requests for the record. First is a copy of the Air Force's...
Gentleman's time, sorry. Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Secretary Kendall, I wanted to ask you, Congress has sent a very clear congressional intent that we would like the department to ramp up towards total rate production. More specifically, the Air Force needs to make investments necessary to ramp F-35 production to 60 on a path to 80 per year, and yet the Air Force is only planning for 48 F-35s a year for the next 5 years. And we're just not buying enough F-35s in adequate necessary numbers to recapitalize the aging fighter fleet. The F-35 is not only the most advanced fighter in the world, but also the most cost-effective to buy and maintain, as our allies are concluding. Do you believe that the Air Force should be buying more F-35s?
Congressman, I think we have a sound balance in our budget between acquisition of new capabilities like the F-35, investment in development of the next generation of capabilities like the next generation air dominance, and sustainment of the current fleet. You know, we try very hard to get the balance right between the current force, the force we can have within the next few years, and the longer term force. What we see overall is the threat increasing over time. And so we have to do a combination of things to try to balance out the risk over time as we make our investments. So we have accepted some risk in the current force. We have tried to move forward modernization, like we did increase the F-35 buy this year. We also increased and extended the F-15EX buy. And we're also investing heavily in the next generation beyond that. So we have tried to get a trajectory, if you will, which accounts for the levels of risk in each of those time frames and responds to them appropriately.
Do you think
we think the balance is about right.
So you think okay. General Brown, I want to ask you, the recent funding announcement for the initial collaborative combat aircraft fleet seems to be a step in the right direction for modernization. The technology to develop and field CCAs is obviously maturing rapidly, and they will likely be in service prior to the next gen air dominance fighters. In the interim, do you intend to pair the initial tranche of CCAs with your most capable fighter, which is the F-35, and are there investments we need to make in F-35s now so they will be ready to team with CCAs when they come online?
We do intend to not only put it with the next generation air dominance, but also with the F-35. I think since we're early in the process for CCAs, it may be too early to actually determine what we would put into the F-35 to allow that capability. But in the big scheme of things, what we want to be able to do is make whatever we do with CCAs transportable to many platforms, not just the F-35 next generation air dominance, but there may be other capabilities and other platforms we can put it on to increase our overall capability.
Oh, good. And with the advent of large CCAs that will soon join the U.S. Air Force fleet, it further highlights the need for modern ABMS network architecture that can leverage commercial innovation, such as 5G technology. And do you think the Air Force will be far enough along in building the new data networks to leverage the CCAs when they come online, perhaps before the end of the decade?
I do, and this is one of the areas where Secretary Kendall, for our C3 battle management, put Major General Cropsey in charge to bring together our architecture and move forward to bring us that capability, which will support not only our collaborative combat aircraft, but many other capabilities in our command and control systems for the Air Force, and also in support of the joint team as well.
Yeah, well, no, thank you very much. Secretary Kendall, I want to ask you something more personnel related. With all of the talk now around recruitment levels being low and so many of the branches struggling, how is the Air Force addressing issues related to diversity and inclusion in its recruiting and retention efforts? And what steps are they taking to promote a culture of respect and professionalism within the ranks, especially now with so many of these types of programs under attack? Which is unfortunate because the military, in many regards, has been the model for people being able to seek promotions and be able to have some sort of advancements in their career.
Yeah, thanks, Congressman Veazey. It's all about readiness. It's all about the effectiveness of the force. We want a force that represents America. It's a diverse country. We're going to have a diverse force, so we want our people to be as capable as possible at building teams of diverse people. So we do training to help people with that exercise. We're trying to bring in the human capital from the U.S. wherever it may be, including traditionally less represented groups. The operational field, something that General Brown and I have talked about a lot, is severely underrepresented in
Gentleman's time
some
expired.
areas.
Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I felt compelled to make an editorial comment because it was mentioned about the vote yesterday, and we need to get a handle on our fiscal We need to have fiscal discipline in this country, or we're going to end up being a third world nation in our lifetime. And when I asked my staff, because I wasn't sure what the number was because it floats so much, what our interest payments were on the debt itself, and found it was nearly $400 billion. General, Mr. Secretary, I suspect that you could do a whole lot with $400 billion. And I know we could have a whole lot of social programs with $400 billion, and we could support meritocracies. And that number is only growing, and it seems like so many members in this chamber don't seem to notice that. It boggles my mind. So I just felt that I needed to just respectfully mention that on the record. Secretary Kendall and General Brown particularly, I am, and as my colleague just mentioned, I partially agreed with the statement about recruiting. I think we're in a crisis. And I would really like to know what, and I don't give a hoot what an airman looks like. I just want qualified airmen. And we are in a crisis right now, and I'd really like to know, General Brown, I'm an Air Force veteran, so I'm partial to the uniform. And, you know, I am. I'm going to admit my bias a little bit here. And we love the Marines, and we love our sailors, and we love our soldiers as well. But yes, yeah, Dr. McCormick, thank you for the stink eye. But General Brown, in all seriousness, what can we do? And please let us know now, because we have the NDA coming up.
You know, one of the key areas that I've highlighted earlier in this particular hearing, that young people only aspire to be what they see, and they want to have opportunity. And the things we have to do is talk about what serving in the military or service at large and the opportunities it provides. And the positive comments that we make about serving and being part of the military is what's going to help us bring those young people in. At the same time, it's how we engage with their influencers, whether it's their parents, whether it's their coaches, whether it's their guidance counselors, whether it's their scout leaders, and with the communities. And as you can go back to each of your districts and talk about, not only what you're doing here in Congress, but also talking about the aspect of the positive value of service in our military and how each one of us have
in general, and I very much apologize, and we probably should talk about this offline because I only have a few minutes left, but we're 535 members up here. What can we do as far as marketing goes? We have to be innovative. I mean, the Marines, since I was a kid, had great commercials and marketing and outreach, and they're the only branch that hits their goals. Granted, they're smaller, but what can we functionally do, and do we need to entice with more bonuses? I remember, it ebbs and flows, right? Sometimes we're chock full of people that want to sign up, and other times we're starving. We're starving for pilots right now, too. And I can remember that. We were starving, we had a surplus of pilots in the 70s, and then we're starving. And then when I graduated in 1990, there were too many, and then my colonel told me, Pat, watch, in 3 years they'll have too few. And that's exactly what happened. So what can we functionally, specifically do? And what can you do?
There are enlistment bonuses, quick ship bonuses, college loan repayment type programs. We're also looking at the aspect of additional recruiters. We have the smallest ratio of recruiters for the United States Air Force, and we need to increase that. But it's also how we engage. You talked about marketing, and there are many more ways to get information to young people and their influencers than just traditional TV commercials that we've done in the past. But it's also the personal engagement that's required. And that's the aspect I get when I talk to her.
In general, if there's also any problems with certain states, because there's some of the school districts I'm hearing from other flag officers that they do the bare minimum. I think maybe it's like 1 hour a month or something like that for recruiting access to the high schools. Let us know, because I think can pass, I hope we could pass it in a bipartisan way if states get a whole bunch of federal monies, and if they don't want to play ball and help us out. This is a national crisis. And it's really scaring me, because year over year it seems to be getting worse, and it's a trend. And I just want to do everything we can to affect it.
That would be very helpful.
And please let us know what we need to do while writing this up. And I think I'm just going to have to ask this question for the record. In this year's budget request, the Air Force included a roadmap to spending nothing in FY23 on collaborative combat aircraft. And then it goes to $400 million in a year, and then eventually to $3 billion in FY28, and that's rapid growth. And generally, I'm encouraged by that, but I believe we need to also think about autonomy with AI-piloted aircraft as well. And I just wanted to, I know we'll submit a couple questions for the record on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Texas. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman and the ranking member for this important hearing. Secretary Kendall and General Brown, it's good to see you again. Thank you, General Saltzman, for your service. As you know, my district is home to Nellis and Creech Air Force bases and the National Test and Training Range. General Brown, I've had the opportunity to ask this question of Secretary Kendall, and as a 1991 graduate of the Air Force Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base yourself, I wanted to ask what role you see Nellis Air Force Base and Creech Air Force Base playing as a part of our national defense strategy.
Well, it plays an excellent role. Yeah, not only was there as a student in 91, I was back as an instructor of 92, 94, and back as the commandant of the weapons school from 2005 to 2007. Nellis and Creech in the Nellis Test and Training Range is a national treasure to help with our national defense, and it's one of the key areas where we do some of our highest end training for the United States Air Force and our joint team. And so there's great value in the not only the base itself, but the range space that we're able to operate in, and we've been able to operate in for decades. And so we appreciate the great support from the community, from the state, and from the congressional delegation to support that training.
Thank you for your insight. It is a national treasure. We look forward to continuing to work with you. Now focusing on the mental health of the UAV pilots. I was glad to see the FY24 Air Force budget made significant investments in our airmen. However, I continue to be concerned about the mental health of our remotely piloted aircraft crews and pilots. A military health system study from 2019 found that remotely piloted aircraft pilots have 32% higher risk of sleep disorders compared to those of all other Air Force occupations. When I was at Creech Air Force Base recently, it was shared with me that there's only one mental health provider who was only able to address acute concerns, which means for more serious concerns, airmen actually have to travel to Nellis, which is almost an hour away, and really it takes months to get an appointment. So what is the Air Force doing to assure that remotely piloted aircraft pilots and their non-pilot crews receive adequate mental health screenings and recovery?
Rep. Hartsford, a couple of things we are doing associated with this is, as you described, for certain career fields, they're higher stress than others. And we're really looking at how we take the shortage of mental health providers that we have across the Air Force and put them in the right areas where there's greater need. Creech is one of those, and as you highlighted, driving to Nellis is probably not the answer on some of these. We're also trying to do an aspect of what we call targeted care to make sure we're putting, those that need the most acute support or getting to mental health providers. But we also look at the aspect of how we engage with their airmen on a regular basis to ensure their mental health, just like their physical health, from that aspect. And it requires bits of leadership for us to be able to do that as well. And this is where our leadership training and working with our leaders. But greater focus on the areas where we have higher stresses is where we're headed to support not only Creech, but other parts of our Air Force.
Thank you. So just during my last district work period, I was at Nellis Air Force Base with the Chief of Staff, looking at the need around our dorm shortage, which is about 575 bed deficit. Airmen are being released into off-base community housing after 11 months, short of the Air Force's requirement of 36-month time in service. And Creech Air Force Base does not even have on-base housing, making it so that service members stationed at Creech have to drive, again, almost an hour for housing at Nellis. So I know this issue is not unique to my district, but based on us being central to the operations of the Air Force and a national treasure, in your testimony, you state that the military housing is another important way that the Air Force has focused on retention in the FY24 budget. So can you tell the committee what the Air Force is specifically doing to address these critical housing needs?
There's a couple of things we're doing. One of the areas that we tend to focus on our military housing is it's mostly on single-family homes. We're looking at options to provide 1- and 2-bedroom apartments from our project owners that do our privatized housing. The other part is how we engage with our communities to highlight the housing need in some aspects. And when I was at Nellis most recently, back in January, had a chance to talk to the leadership there is, how do we identify apartment complexes that we can, in some cases lease, but we need to take a look at how we also build 1- and 2-bedroom apartments. Airports is another location that's has a dearth of housing for either single airmen or small families that don't need a full single-family home, and we're working with OMB to actually start that process. And so we do have some work to do, but we do have a way ahead.
Thank you. Well, I know with the leadership of the chairman and the ranking member and the appropriators, we are going to get there. So thank you for your service. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lalota for 5
Mr.
minutes.
Secretary, Generals, thanks so much for being with us here today. I wanted to discuss a local Air Force issue in my district that has a national impact. And I first mentioned this issue last week at a hearing with some of the Army and Navy brass, but given the audience today, I think it may be a little more appropriate and you may be able to provide me some insight into this issue. My Long Island district is home to the 106th Rescue Wing with the Air National Guard. As you gentlemen, I'm sure know, the 106 provides personnel recovery, combat search and rescue, expeditionary combat support, civil search and rescue support to federal and state authorities. And it has recently come out that the Air Combat Command is considering cutting the total number of Air National Guard HH-60s from 18 to 16 total aircraft, and will require the 106 to go from 6 to 5. If this decision is confirmed, and I hope that it doesn't get confirmed, this would directly affect negatively the operational effectiveness of the 106th Rescue Wing. So, Mr. Secretary, General Brown, are you aware of this decision? Are you aware of any logic or insight into it?
I know we are working through the aspect of, as we make the transition from the HH-60 Golf to the HH-60 Whiskey, based on their procurement, we'll determine how we best lay out the balance across the force. I don't have the specifics on your particular unit there in your district, but I will get back to you on with the additional details.
Yeah, I don't think a final decision's been made.
And I hope that before that decision is made, one would reflect upon the impact of going from 6 to 5. A 17% reduction is much more harmful than a unit that may be going from 25 to 24 aircraft. That loss can be absorbed more by a larger number, as you know. These aircraft spend a lot of time in maintenance, being offline. When you have 6, you really don't have 6. You probably have more like 4 or 3. And when you have 5, you probably have more like 3 or 2. So that impact of that reduction of that size from 6 to 5 is tremendously harmful to the 106 that provides a lot of great operations where it is. So I hope that you'll look into it. What do you need from us in order to make the best decision there possible, gentlemen?
I'm not aware of anything, but if there is anything, we'll let you know.
You want to add anything, General?
No, same.
And I would ask, Mr. Secretary, can you commit to discussing this situation with General Mark Kelly and reporting back to my office about it, sir?
Yes, I will.
Awesome. Thanks a bunch, gentlemen. I yield back my time, sir.
I think the gentleman, the chair now recognizes an outstanding member from the great state of Alabama, Ms. Sewell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, gentlemen. The district I proudly represent, is home to Maxwell Air Force Base, the 117th Air Refueling Wing, and the 187th Fighter Wing. Our airmen and women are pillars of our community, so ensuring that they have the resources and support they need remain my top priority. Moreover, while we focus on increasing the readiness of our Air Force, we must also ensure that America maintains our space superiority. Last year, the GAO report to Congress confirmed that Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama is the best place for the U.S. Space Command headquarters. Also, the IG report said, quote, "We determined that the 2020 basing action process directed by the Secretary of Defense complied with federal law and DoD policy and that that process was reasonable," unquote. I'm grateful to the Pentagon IG and the GAO for conducting these reviews, which show that throughout the Air Force's evaluation process, Redstone Arsenal was always considered the most qualified location for the U.S. Space Command headquarters. The GAO and the Pentagon IG confirm what we had already known, we in Alabama, that there's no better home for Space Command than the Rocket City. This decision has been in limbo for far too long, Mr. Secretary. So I hope that a final decision will be coming soon. I believe that our military readiness in space depends upon that. Enough is enough, as my chairman would say. My first question is to you. As you know, the 187th fighter wing has a rich tradition and a rich history. The legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen began in Montgomery, Alabama, and a number of the current F-16 fighter jet tail wings are painted bright red to honor the Tuskegee Airmen. The 187th is proud to continue that legacy by becoming home to the F-35A Lightning fighter jet. However, the delivery of the F-35 has been delayed due to technical issues that I understand have been figured out, and I understand that Lockheed Martin has resumed delivery of the F-35. Mr. Secretary, I was hoping that you can provide an update for when we in Alabama can expect our delivery for the 187th.
I'm going to have to take that for the record, but I'll get back to you on that and let you know.
Great. My next question is to General Saltzman. The National Security Space Launch Program, which includes the United Launch Alliance and SpaceX, has successfully executed 97 launches while also reducing costs. Could you elaborate on the importance of the program and the need to continue investment to increase our launch cadence to improve the resilience of our satellite architecture?
I've often compared the ability or the national space launch infrastructure is to space operations as runways are to air operations. It's vital, it's critical, it's foundational. We are looking at every possible way to take advantage of the tremendous growth in commercial space launch providers. And we are investing in the infrastructure, and we are looking at changing policies and procedures to make sure that we can maximize those opportunities, so it's vital.
General Brown, in the remaining time, as the Air Force continues to wrestle with the pilot shortfall while also striving to improve Air Force readiness, can you elaborate on the important role that Air University at Maxwell Air Force Base has in educating our airmen and women?
It plays a distinct role. Matter of fact, I was at Maxwell just last week and had a chance to spend time there at Maxwell and then also over at Auburn to talk to their aviation program. And the connection between the rich heritage of Maxwell and the education it provides our airmen as they come, not only our airmen, but also our joint teammates and our allies and partners. But it brings us some foundational from all the way from our NCOs, but also our officer training, but also as we do our developmental education, it plays a very distinct role in helping shape our Air Force and our doctrine as well.
Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair now recognizes the Vice Chairman of the committee, gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us today. Secretary Kendall, General Brown, General Saltzman, thank you so much for your service and for all that you do for our nation. Secretary Kendall, General Brown, I want to set the stage. The Air Force's FY 23 to 28 fight-up request is to retire 801 fighter aircraft and build 345. And I can go down through the list. Essentially, the new aircraft coming on board are F-35As and F-15EXs. And I'm not opposed to retiring aircraft, and I'm not a mathematician. But I have a hard time figuring out how we are doing addition by subtraction. And my question is this: in your professional military judgment, is the 801 divestment versus the 345 aircraft investment, is that the proper alignment of procurement versus divestment necessary to counter the Chinese threat, necessary to deter the Chinese in the face of what I believe is probably the most challenging time strategically this nation has faced in our lifetimes?
In this case, it is. And the math is really about combat capability and exchange ratios. We're buying, we accelerated or increased the buy of the F-35 this year. When we do exercises, we put 5th generation aircraft against 4th generation. There's no comparison. And if you look at an aircraft that we're retiring like the A-10, it is much less than a fully capable 4th generation aircraft. It just wasn't equipped to do that kind of job. So we are buying much more combat power with the things we're adding to the inventory than we have with the things we're taking out. And I'll let General Brown add to that if he wants to.
Rep. Whitman, what I would also add is In order to keep these additional aircraft that if we talk about divesting, they don't provide the capability. And so what we're doing is we're buying what I would say aircraft that are not going to be in a place to actually be able to provide us the combat power we're going to need. Ideally, over time, we would have laid this out to balance this out, but this is going to give us the best mix of capability vis-a-vis the threat. And it's not just the airplanes. It's also the munitions, it's the sensors, it's the command and control that goes all with this to give us the combat credibility and capability that we need.
Listen, I don't disagree with your assessment of the capability of some of the legacy aircraft that we are retiring. No two ways about it. A-10s, F-15Cs and Ds, understand it. But there's still some capability there. Now, whether it's directly translatable to the threat in the Indo-PACOM, we can have a debate back and forth with that. So taking that as the case that we are going to retire those 801 aircraft, and we are going to look at F-35As and F-15EXs. To me, there ought to be in the Air Force's plan, as part of that, a bridge. And that bridge, in my mind, should be the unmanned component, the CCA component, where you could build quickly with existing platforms that are already out there today that a whole cadre of companies are manufacturing. Those platforms, roughly $8 or $9 million a platform. And let's say you add $10 million additional for weapons to go on those platforms. That's something that could be purchased today. You don't have to do a program or record. It could be purchased today as a bridge to F-35 additional capability, to whatever comes next in the next generation air defense system. Tell me, are there plans for the Air Force to bridge that gap where we're going down through this trough? Even though the aircraft we're bringing on are more capable, they're still not there yet. So there's still a gap that we're facing. Tell me that you all have at least considered the CCA component of what we need to do.
You're raising a good point, Congressman. The guidance we've given for all of our programs is to move them forward so that we get meaningful combat capability as fast as possible. CCAs are a good example of that. We have a pretty aggressive schedule for CCAs, but we want to introduce them to the force as soon as we can. The technologies that were developed over the last few years in particular, and a lot of work I've had done by boards of experts and so on, my scientific advisory board, tells us that we can move forward with development of that platform, that it will get to a place where its capabilities are going to be very cost-effective for us. In parallel with that, though, we've got to work out a lot of things about organizational structures, tactics, techniques, and procedures, maintenance approaches, logistics, how we organize the force, and then how it all fights together and is sustained. So we're buying a few platforms to do that, to have experimentation along those lines, and we're buying some.
Gentleman's time's expired. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I just want to point out that I'm a third-generation military pilot from an Air Force family. I'm the black sheep of the family, and although I may have my bias about which service does aviation best, I'm also an aircraft controller, forward aircraft controller, so a lot of my focus will be on that and how you guys are still in a support mission for ground forces. I will say that it worries me because when I first came in the Marine Corps, I noticed one thing about the Air Force, your motto. It really stood out to me because as a forward aircraft controller who had to put bombs on target, I never understood a motto like aim high. And then you guys spent millions of dollars coming up with a new one, nothing comes close. So as an aircraft controller, I'm a little concerned about that. When you guys talked about your reorganization into the future with your tactical air control party, I noticed there's about a 44% cut in the amount you're spending on it. And my concern, along with how we're reorganizing, diverging from the A-10s to the F-35s in ground support, and knowing how critical the A-10s have been in ground support, that we're in that command and staff kind of idea of we're moving away from ground support towards just dominating the skies. And I'm worried that the F-35 can't do the mission as well as the A-10 can, and that we're having fewer tactical aircraft parties in the field being able to do their job. Basically, I'm worried about the ground support. And could you address that, please?
Sure. As we make the transition to the future, and as we've done our war games and analysis, we'll still do close air support. But the ratio close air support to what we've done, particularly over the course of the past 20 years in the Middle East, I would say 30 years going back to Desert Shield, Desert Storm, that ratio of close air support or close air support-like missions is different. And so as you look at the TACP career field, but also the aspect of the platforms we bring in, all the services are transitioning. And you think about the Marine Corps, they're going away from the FA-18 to full F-35 fleet to do the exact same thing we're asking the United States Air Force to do. It's to provide support to our service members on the ground and our allies and partners on the ground. And so we are just as committed to supporting them no matter what platform we fly to provide the air power anytime, anywhere in support of what's going on the ground, air superiority, global strike, all these together we're very focused on to be able to get there. But the TACP career field, as we make that transition, we also have to transition the aspect and the makeup of the Air Force to get there. We'll still have TACPs, we'll still have that expertise, but the number will shift a bit as you described.
Yeah. Hopefully we don't suffer as a consequence of that, just in our ground support. Like I said, I understand we think we always evolve, but we always come back to the ground has to be owned, and you're a big part of helping us do that. Have we done a side-by-side comparison to the F-35 compared to the A-10 and its anti-armor mission?
Well, not so much on the anti-armor, but there was testing to compare the mission sets between the A-10 and F-35. And so that was done. One thing I'd also highlight to you is that a good majority of those that are going to be flying F-35, really most of the A-10 pods are going to go into F-35. Matter of fact, the wing commander at Luke, where we do F-35 training, is an A-10 Weapons School graduate. The previous wing commander that was at Hill flying F-35s was an A-10 Weapons School graduate. And so that expertise, they'll be in a different airplane, but you'll still have that same expertise going forward. And you'll see a number of A-10 pods flying F-35s.
And I appreciate that we did the same thing in the Osprey when we transitioned. But the difference in capabilities, what I'm more worried about, as you know, is better than I do. The A-10 was designed around a gun, a very effective gun that when we did war games or when we had the turkey shoot, it destroyed armor in a very real way, very quickly. It changed the face of the battlefield. And I just wondered if you had any comparison side by side about the effectiveness of an F-35 taking out a tank one after another and another. And if we're going to lose, we're going to degrade our capabilities in supporting our ground.
Yeah, what I would highlight is, when you were just using the gun was much more effective than a dumb Mark 82.
Yeah.
But a laser-guided munition or a GPS-guided munition is much more effective now than a gun. And so, that's the part I think about as a chief of staff of the Air Force is the effectiveness of the capabilities we have and not get stuck in a paradigm, but think more broadly about the capabilities that we provide.
Okay, and with my final 15 seconds, I'll just suggest maybe a new motto of on target.
Got it.
Simplify, thanks.
I thank the gentleman. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Alford, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and thank you to our distinguished witnesses today. Appreciate you being here. I'm honored to represent the home of the B-2 bomber, Whiteman Air Force Base in just outside of Sedalia, Missouri. I recently visited Palmdale, California with Chairman Kelly to see the B-21 firsthand. Very impressed with that platform. It's going to be exciting to see the power that it projects for America. I also want to make sure, and as I know you do, to keep the B-2 as lethal as capable and as possible until the B-21 is operational and fielded in sufficient numbers. As you know, we've been talking about today that we're facing a difficult balancing act of keeping some of our older aircraft around, in particular the A-10, which I'm concerned about today. Secretary Kendall, let me ask you first, what factors go into your decision-making when deciding what follow-on missions will replace the remaining A-10s?
Generally, I look at the entire suite of missions we're trying to perform, but we're driven by the pacing challenge and what it is confronting us with. And essentially, I'd love to give you the classified briefing on that. I don't know if you've had it or not. We've given it to a lot of people. But basically, China has been trying to field the capability to deny us and circumvent some of the systems that we have fielded and depended upon for quite some time. So they're being creative about their use of sensors of various types. They're being aggressive about their air-to-air weapons, and they're integrating other capabilities together with their air platforms, and they're integrating their air platforms themselves in a way which is very effective. So we've got a very serious challenge for control of the sky. We also have a very serious challenge on the basis of affordability. The aircraft that we currently have in production, both the EX and the F-35, are cost on the order of $85 million to $100 million apiece. The NGAD platform, the Next Generation Air Dominance manned platform, is going to cost multiple times those numbers. So we're introducing the CCAs that we were talking about earlier, the collaborative combat aircraft, to get a unit cost item into the fleet that is very cost effective and improves our ratio capability on an affordability and a cost effectiveness basis. So that's the mix that we're looking at. We want to ensure, as General Brown mentioned, that we continue to perform all the missions we've traditionally had to perform. So China is not the only problem we have to solve. We also have to worry about possible conflict in a number of other places. You know, we were talking about killing armor. We're interested in acts of aggression, whether it's ground forces or a maritime act of aggression. And we want to be able to take on both of those types of threats. But we got to control the air first. So that's mission number one. And we still have to obviously have capability against terrorisms and other groups like that. So we try to ensure that we're covering the waterfront, all those things that we have to do, but focus primarily on the pacing challenge. That's why we call it the pacing challenge.
Thank you, sir. General Brown, I appreciate our conversation several weeks ago. Look forward to getting to know you better. We did talk about the 442nd Fighter Wing at Whiteman Air Force Base, critical, I think, to the mission there. It's a great complement to the Black Hawk MQ-9, the stealth bomber. Can you, and I was encouraged to hear you say that most of the A-10 program will be going to the F-35. Can you commit that the F-35 is a possibility to coming to Whiteman Air Force Base so that the 442nd can remain a fighter wing?
Well, I will tell you that, I can't commit to you what exactly is going to happen, but I will commit that I will work with you. But I'll also tell you that we're going to work through the various options of mission sets that will support there at Wyman.
What are those other options, sir?
Well, some of those are, as Secretary Kendall, another flying mission, whether it's in the B-21 is an example. Other operational type missions or enduring type missions. It really depends on our F-35 procurement and opportunities to as we look across the force of where we're going to be able to put those, how we bed down the aircraft over time.
I do understand there's going to be some differences we can't talk about in this setting with the B-21 bedding down than the B-2. I know there's going to be operational differences. I have visited personally with the 442nd, these proud men and women who want to remain a fighter wing. We're talking today about this gap period. That concerns me, that the A-10 is going to go away in 28, and we're going to have this gap with hundreds of fine warriors who really won't have a mission. That concerns me.
Well, that's our effort, is to the best of our ability to minimize that gap and ensure we retain that experience, particularly from our Guard and Reserve, in addition to our active duty.
I look forward to working with you on that, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Chair, and I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Gates, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Secretary, it's always an honor to have you in our district. The folks at Air Force Special Operations Command at Hurlburt Field, we're particularly honored and grateful to be able to share the work they do with you. I've got a niche issue there that I hope I can draw your attention to. The 919th is the reserve component at Duke Field that supports a lot of what Air Force Special Operations Command does. Got a lot of pilots there, got a lot of special tactics folks there with a lot of experience, live in the community, have come out of oftentimes AFSOC. And right now there seems to be some confusion about what the future of the 919th is and the 711th therein, because AFRIC sees that they've got a price tag and AFSOC sees that they've got a price tag, and because they nestle between those two, there's going to be hundreds of billets come October that are fully funded, but with no real mission, because the Dornier that was there is not going to be there. So I don't expect you to have all the answers to that in this hearing, but at least wanted to use our time to highlight the concerns those folks have, and to every extent we can encourage General Healy to get an answer to those folks regarding what their future is. I think it'll help, because a whole lot of experience, at times decades of experience, and we don't want to lose that out of AFSOC or out of the reserve. I'll give you a chance to make any comments if you'd like.
We'll take a look at that and get back to you. I don't have details on that for you right now. If I could take a moment of your time. My visit, first district visit I made to your district, I think was one of the most memorable moments of my tenure in office and probably of my life, which was the Doolittle Raider last toast. And that was quite a moment. And going to Hurlburt was was enjoyable and interesting, but nothing like the significance of that last toast.
Yes, and
you
we
there
were
too, I
also
think.
grateful to have General Brown there for that as well. General Brown, I do have to ask you a question that sort of stems from what Ms. McLean was asking about. She showed you this curriculum from the Air Force Academy, and she asked you why the terms mom and dad were disfavored. And you said that you're working to build cohesive teams. So just wondering, how do the terms mom and dad impair cohesive team building?
You know, part of leadership is understanding the people you're privileged to lead. And as you have that opportunity, you get to know them. And every one of us grows up differently and has different experiences, different backgrounds. And we can't assume when we engage with them. And so from that perspective, you've got to to build that team and to build that trust with our airmen. In part because that trust is part of the cohesion that gives you the strong team to be able to go execute what the nation asks us to do.
I understand better than most that families at times aren't defined by blood or even paperwork, and I know you have to recruit folks from different family environments into the Air Force. But do you think maybe it puts downward pressure on recruiting some of the people who do have moms and dads and do use the term mom and dad, if in the curriculum of the academy it seems to disfavor those terms?
No, I don't.
And what's your basis for that belief?
Because I think part of leadership is dignity and respect of those you're privileged to lead.
You don't think it disrespects people?
I do not.
You don't think it disrespects moms and dads when they send their young children, I guess, becoming adults, into the academy, and then they see that mom and dad are disfavored terms? Do you agree that mom and dad should be disfavored terms?
I think we need to respect the fact that they have either parents, grandparents, aunts, and uncles that sometimes raised young people.
Sure, but I mean, I know folks who've been raised by aunts and uncles, and none of them have ever told me that when they hear someone else call their parent mom or dad, that upsets them. Do you know of people who feel excluded when others refer to their parents as mom or dad?
I don't, or either way, whether it's aunts, uncles, moms, and dads, I have not come across anyone that
Congressman, if I could,
Sure.
the point of that slide, I'm familiar with it, came out of the Air Force Academy. It was actually created by cadets for training, and it's not very artful, but the point was that you shouldn't, it was not to diminish moms and dads. It was to just make people aware of that particular family configuration, not the.
I don't know, Mr. Secretary. It says that you want to use parents, caregivers, or guardians instead of mom and dad. So when you say instead of, it kind of does seem to disfavor it. And I appreciate not every slide is perfect, and if you're saying this isn't artful and we're not going to try to disfavor mom or dad or make people feel bad, I think that would be progress to hear.
You're correct. It wasn't
Okay,
artful.
great.
I don't think they're using that slide anymore.
And one thing the chairman and I certainly would not take exception with is that you seem to favor the term y'all. So no objection there.
General Brown, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to follow up on something you just stated because I got to be honest, I took a bit of a personal offense to this. You're saying that your belief is that it's more cohesive to not use the term mom and dad with regards to leadership. Is that correct?
Now, what I'm saying, Congressman, is that be respectful and get to know your airmen before you just assume. And that's the aspect of what I'm talking about is you have to, part of leadership is getting to know the people you're privileged to lead. And the better you understand them, the better you can build trust. And the better you build that trust, the more cohesive team you have to do what the nation's asked us to do as military members.
So I guess then by that logic, throughout my time in the military as a non-commissioned officer, where I allowed every one of our team members, whether it was out operational or back home, that when they would say mom and dad, I should have in some way have corrected them in this because I wasn't building a cohesive unit. Very interesting, I must say, especially with my military and government time spending over 7 years in Iraq, 3 years in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia. Thank you for correcting me in my remiss way of leadership. I want to switch to something which is actually very important to the ongoing finance discussion, which is we keep looking at everything from a hardware perspective with regards to military aircraft or a gun-to-gun, bomb-to-bomb, bullet-to-bullet type kinetic element of warfare. I want to know how much of the budget is going towards things like the research of quantum entanglement, which I think is going to be exceptionally important as we look into AI, autonomous drone capabilities and assets. I also think that in recognition that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea has a geopolitical alignment that is really economic resource and innovation-based warfare, I'd love to know how we are utilizing our budget to help us to advance in the quantum war space that I think could be detrimental to China's advancement.
It is one of the areas we're investing in. There's a lot of concern about quantum capability from the point of view of quantum computing in particular, and its potential for decryption of a lot of our current sets of encryption capabilities. There are advanced communications possibilities, secure communications possibilities as well. So it's one of the things that I believe the Undersecretary for Research and Engineering has on her list of technologies to emphasize. It's also one of the technologies included under the AUKUS program, where we're working closely with Australia and the UK. There's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of uncertainty as to when that technology is going to mature, but it's very important for us to invest in, and I agree with you on that.
Would you like to add to that at all, General?
I was just going to add that software-defined anything is better. When I talk about deploying my capabilities, they don't come home. A lot of them stay on orbit forever, quite frankly. And so the ability to upgrade, to redefine based on software upgrades, and along the lines that you're talking about is a tremendous advantage, and we're investing in that.
I absolutely agree, and especially with the idea or mindset that we can utilize those satellites that you send above or this quantum technology to help to essentially turn our enemy into being blind, dumb, and deaf, right? And that's ultimately a capability to try and control a battle space in warfare. Moving on to recruitment. I noted in the DoD IG report that they said that the pandemic can no longer be utilized as an excuse for our failures in recruitment efforts. What do you think is contributing the most significantly outside of our need to increase the quality of life, which I agree with, things like adding childcare, things like ensuring that our military soldiers' pay is comparable to the rate of inflation to make sure we're not invisibly defunding them, but also looking at MILCON that is needed to help upgrade the barracks and provide more housing availability and affordability, off-post housing. What do you think is the most significant reason why we are armed forces-wide over 25,000 in deficit, and even in the Air Force looking at shortages within the pilots?
The thing that's affecting young people mostly is lack of awareness of the military, lack of an understanding of what the military has to offer. They're a long way away from thinking about housing and child development centers. They're thinking about, what am I going to get out of this? And a lot of them, from the surveys that have been done, are worried about their safety, that if they go in that they won't be safe. So we really need to educate people. The number of people who have had parents serve in the military used to be something like 40%. It's down to less than 15 now. So all of us need to, and it was mentioned earlier by General Brown and myself, and I think General Saltzman too, we all need to reach out to people where we have the opportunity to try to communicate about what the military has to offer. Again, retention is fine. We're keeping people. We're addressing all those other problems, but we're still keeping people. We need to get through to young people and let them know what we have to offer, and I think we'll prevail. I don't think we have a recruiting crisis in response to the earlier comment. I think we have a problem that we can manage our way through, and what we're doing is having an effect. So
Gentleman's time's expired.
Sorry.
Thank you.
I want to thank the witnesses. You did a great job today. It's been very helpful to us. The ranking member is recognized for any comments he may have. All right. Unfortunately, I don't have any more members of the Alabama delegation to talk about Space Command, but with that, we're adjourned.